At Thanksgiving dinner at my son's house, an unknown number flashed on my phone. A voice simply said, "Go home right now or you will regret it, and whatever you do, do not tell your son." When I got home, what I saw left me frozen. But before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistook your silence for weakness. My name is Dwayne Rollins. I am 69 years old, a former construction supervisor who spent 40 years building foundations out of concrete and steel. I thought I had built a solid foundation for my family. I was wrong. The air in my son Jordan's upscale dining room felt heavy that evening. We were gathered around a massive mahogany table for Thanksgiving dinner. Heather, my daughter-in-law, sat at the opposite end wearing a designer dress paid for by my hard work. She held a crystal wine glass and smiled tightly at the guests. She leaned forward and sighed loudly. "It is just so hard these days," she announced to the room, her eyes fixed entirely on me. "Dwayne is getting so forgetful. Last week he left his keys on the counter. We are really starting to worry about his declining mental state. It might be time to discuss better care options for him." The guests murmured sympathetically. I had not forgotten my keys. Heather had moved them while I was in the restroom. I looked at my son Jordan. He stared intently at his mashed potatoes, refusing to meet my eyes. His cowardly silence spoke louder than her insults. He was deliberately letting her lay the groundwork to declare me incompetent. I did not defend myself. Arguing with a manipulator only gives them the audience they crave. I simply took a very slow bite of my roasted turkey, maintaining absolute composure. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, waiting for an explosion that never came. Then my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out. The screen displayed an unknown number. Normally I would ignore it, but a strange instinct urged me to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear. A hushed, trembling female voice spoke rapidly on the other end. "Go home right now." I frowned, shielding my mouth with my napkin. "Who is this?" I asked quietly. "Just drive home or you will regret it," the voice whispered frantically. "Don't tell your son." The line went dead before I could demand an explanation. A cold chill crept up my spine. This was not a prank. The raw fear in that woman's voice was unmistakable. I looked up from my phone. Heather was still talking, painting a pathetic picture of my supposed vulnerability to her captivated friends. Jordan was nodding along like a trained dog. I stood up slowly. The screech of my heavy wooden chair against the hardwood floor silenced the entire room. Everyone at the table stared at me in total shock. "Where are you going?" Heather demanded, her tone dripping with false concern. "We are about to serve the pie." I did not look at her. I did not say a single word. I carefully placed my cloth napkin on the table, picked up my coat, and walked straight out the front door. I ignored Jordan calling my name from the porch. I had spent my entire adult life analyzing hidden structural flaws, and my gut told me my life was about to collapse. I climbed into my old Ford truck and started the engine. The heater roared to life, fighting against the bitter November wind, but it could not warm the cold dread settling in my chest. The streets of our quiet suburb were practically empty, illuminated only by flickering amber streetlights. As I drove the familiar route back to my neighborhood, my mind wandered to Loretta. My beautiful, fiercely intelligent wife passed away 5 years ago, but her presence still lingered in every corner of the home we had built together. We bought that 3-bedroom brick house 40 years ago when I was just a foreman and she was a public school teacher. We scraped together every penny we had to make the down payment. It was our fortress, our sanctuary, away from a world that rarely handed us anything easily. Loretta spent decades cultivating her prized rose bushes in the front yard, while I practically rebuilt the interior with my own 2 bare hands. Every wooden beam, every laid brick held a piece of our shared history. We raised Jordan in that house, trying to teach him the value of hard work and honest living. Clearly, those lessons had faded the moment he married Heather. She had always viewed my home as an outdated burden, a gold mine waiting to be liquidated. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning ashen. The desperate warning from the phone call echoed relentlessly in my head. "Don't tell your son." Why would my very own flesh and blood be involved in something so incredibly dark and sinister? What had they done behind my back while I was mourning my wife? I pressed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. I needed to see my house. I needed to know that the only tangible memory I had left of Loretta was still perfectly safe. I turned onto my street and my heart completely stopped. A massive white moving truck was parked illegally across my front lawn, crushing Loretta's dormant rose bushes into the muddy earth. The heavy steel ramp was fully extended, resting aggressively on my porch steps. My front door was thrown wide open, letting the freezing night air rush straight into my home. Every single light inside the house was blazing brightly. I slammed the brakes hard and quickly threw my old truck into park, leaving the engine running. Before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, two burly men emerged from the open doorway. They were not wearing uniforms. They were just strangers casually hauling my entire life out into the cold. My blood ran icy, turning into pure, unadulterated rage as I saw exactly what they were carrying between them. It was Loretta's antique grandfather clock. She had purchased that beautiful clock at an auction over 30 years ago. She used to polish the mahogany wood every single Sunday morning, humming her favorite gospel songs. It was the centerpiece of our living room, the heartbeat of our home. And now these two unknown men were tilting it sideways carelessly, maneuvering it down my front steps. One of the men laughed loudly at a joke the other made, almost dropping the heavy brass pendulum onto the concrete walkway. They were treating my most precious memories like cheap garbage. I ripped my keys from the ignition and shoved my truck door open. I did not yell, I did not run. I walked toward them with the measured, deadly precision of a man who suddenly realizes he has nothing left to lose. They had completely and unlawfully invaded my most private sanctuary. Now they were definitely going to pay the absolute and devastating price. I stepped directly into the path of the two men carrying Loretta's clock. "Put it down," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low register that left no room for negotiation. They hesitated, looking at each other, then gently lowered the heavy mahogany piece onto the damp grass. I did not wait for their explanation. I marched straight past them and crossed the threshold of my home. Inside the living room was practically unrecognizable. All the furniture we had carefully selected over 4 decades was shoved against the walls or missing completely. Standing in the center of the room, right where my wife used to knit her sweaters, was a young white couple. The man was holding a yellow tape measure against the door frame while the woman was making notes on a sleek tablet. They both snapped their heads toward me as I entered. "Excuse me," the man said, lowering the tape measure with an annoyed expression. "You cannot just walk in here. This is a private construction site." I felt a muscle twitch in my jaw. I looked around the room, taking in the sheer audacity of the scene. "I am Dwayne Rollins," I stated clearly, planting my feet firmly onto the hardwood floor I had sanded and varnished myself. "And you are standing in my house." The woman scoffed, rolling her eyes as she tapped her tablet. "No," she replied in a condescendingly sweet tone. "We bought this property yesterday. Now please leave before we call the authorities." "Call them," I challenged, crossing my arms over my chest. "I will gladly wait right here while you explain to the police how you broke into a locked residence." The man let out a very loud and frustrated sigh, reaching into a leather briefcase resting on the fireplace mantel. "We did not break in," he said, pulling out a thick manila folder. "We used the new keys given to us at closing. We are property developers. We closed on this house at noon today." He marched over and shoved a stack of stapled papers directly into my chest. I caught the documents, my eyes instantly scanning the bold black letters at the top of the page. It was a warranty deed. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. Years of reading complex architectural blueprints had trained me to find the microscopic details that others missed. I flipped past the standard legal jargon straight to the signature pages. There it was. A signature that looked remarkably like mine, authorizing the sale of the property to a corporate entity called Horizon Holdings LLC. But I knew I had not signed anything. I flipped to the preceding document attached to the deed. It was a durable power of attorney. It granted full legal authority to handle all real estate transactions on my behalf to my daughter-in-law, Heather Rollins. I stared at the official notary stamp at the bottom of the page. The ink was fresh. The betrayal was absolute. She had not just insulted me at a dinner party. She had stolen the very roof over my head. "You bought stolen property?" I told the man, tossing the documents back onto the mantel. "That signature is a complete forgery. I never gave anyone the right to sell this land." The woman laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "That is not our problem, old man. The title company legally cleared it. The funds have been transferred. You need to take it up with your family. Now get out, or I am calling the cops to remove a trespasser." "Make the call right now," I said coldly to them. 5 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car illuminated the living room walls. 2 uniformed police officers stepped through the open front door, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The developers immediately launched into their rehearsed narrative, aggressively waving the stamped legal documents in the air and pointing accusatory fingers at me. The older officer, a tall man with a graying mustache, took the folder and began reviewing the paperwork. I watched his eyes scan the pages, waiting for him to recognize the obvious fraud. "Officer, that power of attorney is entirely fake," I stated calmly, ensuring my voice betrayed zero emotion. "I am the sole owner. I did not sign those papers, and I certainly did not consent to this sale." The officer sighed heavily, tapping the papers against his clipboard. "Sir, the notary stamp is valid and the county clerk has already recorded the deed. Everything right here looks legally binding on paper. If you are claiming forgery, that is a civil matter. You will have to take it up with a judge in civil court. I cannot determine fraud out here in the field." The agonizing realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The system was not designed to protect the innocent in real time. It was designed to protect the paperwork. Heather knew this. She knew that by the time I managed to hire a lawyer, file an injunction, and navigate the painfully slow court system, these developers would have already gutted the house and flipped it for a massive profit. Law enforcement was essentially powerless to stop a crime committed with a pen instead of a gun. The weary police officer handed the thick folder back to the developer and slowly turned to face me. "Mr. Rollins," the officer said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic but firm tone, "since they hold the recorded deed and the keys, they are the legal occupants right now. I am going to have to ask you to step off the property. If you refuse to leave, I will be forced to arrest you for criminal trespassing." I looked at the officer, then at the arrogant smirks plastered across the faces of the developers. They had won this battle without throwing a single punch. I could fight them and end up in a jail cell, or I could walk away and prepare for a war. A man who builds skyscrapers knows that you never strike until your foundation is secure. "I will leave," I said quietly. I turned my back on the people desecrating Loretta's home and walked out the front door, stepping past the antique clock still sitting abandoned on the wet grass. As I walked down the driveway toward my truck, the freezing wind bit into my skin. My mind raced, piecing together the timeline of this elaborate theft. A month ago, I had a minor fall and spent one afternoon in the hospital for observation. Jordan and Heather had rushed to my bedside, bringing a stack of insurance release forms for me to sign in my groggy state. That was it. That was the exact moment she slipped the power of attorney into the massive pile. She had used my brief moment of physical vulnerability to legally erase my entire existence. I opened the heavy metal door of my truck and climbed inside. I was effectively homeless on Thanksgiving night, stripped of my history and my sanctuary. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I needed to check my retirement accounts immediately. I sat alone in the freezing cab of my old Ford truck parked just down the street from the house that no longer belonged to me. The bitter November wind whipped against the windshield, howling through the poorly sealed doors. But the physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the complete ice currently running through my veins. Through the rearview mirror, I could still see the blindingly bright lights of my former living room piercing the darkness. Those arrogant developers were probably already ripping up the carpet Loretta and I had carefully chosen together. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, taking slow, measured breaths to keep my heart rate completely steady. Panic is a luxury a man cannot afford when the ground beneath him is actively crumbling. I needed to assess the structural damage to my life right now. I reached into my heavy coat pocket with numb fingers and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dark cabin, casting a harsh blue glow across my weathered face. As a retired construction supervisor, I always made sure to maintain an emergency safety net. I had worked tirelessly for over 40 years, saving every possible dime to ensure I would never become a financial burden to anyone. I tapped the icon for my banking application, the facial recognition quickly unlocking the secure portal. My plan was simple and highly logical. I would drive to a quiet hotel, book a room for the next week, and use my substantial savings to hire the most ruthless real estate attorney in the entire state to destroy Heather and her fabricated documents. I watched the small loading circle spin on the screen, waiting for my account dashboard to load fully, expecting to see my entire life savings waiting there securely. The dashboard finally materialized, displaying my main checking and savings accounts in bold white text. I stared at the screen, my brain refusing to process the numbers reflecting back at me. I blinked hard, wiping a gloved hand across my eyes, thinking the blue light was playing cruel tricks on my vision. I looked again, but the mathematical reality remained completely unchanged. The balance in my primary checking account, which should have held enough to cover a few months of daily expenses, was zero. I immediately frantically swiped down to refresh the application, desperately hoping for a simple network glitch. The page reloaded and my eyes darted straight down to my high-yield savings account. That account held my entire retirement fund plus the massive cash deposit from the unauthorized sale of my house. It was supposed to hold well over $600,000. Instead, the bold digits read zero. Panic finally broke through my disciplined exterior. I aggressively tapped the transaction history tab, my fingers shaking violently against the smooth glass. The ledger loaded instantly, revealing a devastating truth in bright red lettering. Just 1 hour ago, while I was sitting quietly at that Thanksgiving table, tolerating my own daughter-in-law's endless disrespect, an outgoing wire transfer was initiated. Exactly $600,000 had been moved directly out of my savings account into a completely unknown offshore routing number. They had not just stolen the roof over my head, they had methodically drained every single drop of sweat and blood I had sacrificed over 40 years of grueling labor. They had weaponized that forged power of attorney to seize complete control of my entire financial identity. I was sitting in a freezing truck with absolutely nothing left to my name but the clothes on my back. Suddenly, the bright screen of my phone flashed, vibrating fiercely in my cold palm. An incoming call replaced my empty bank account interface. The caller ID displayed my son's name in bold letters, Jordan. My thumb hovered heavily over the green accept button. A foolish, desperate part of me hoped he was calling to apologize, to tell me there had been a massive mistake, or that Heather had acted entirely alone without his knowledge. I slowly pressed the phone tightly against my ear, answering the incoming call in absolute silence, waiting to see what kind of man I had actually raised. Instead of an apology, a vicious scream tore through the small speaker. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Jordan yelled, his voice laced with pure indignation rather than any ounce of guilt. "You completely ruined Thanksgiving for everyone. Heather is inside crying right now because you humiliated her in front of all our important guests by storming out like a giant toddler." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer absurdity of his words wash over me. He was not calling to check on my well-being. He was calling to reprimand me for embarrassing his deceptive wife. "You ruined the entire evening," he continued to rant loudly. "We had a beautiful dinner planned, and you selfishly made it all about your own dramatic exit. You always have to be the absolute center of attention, don't you?" My silence seemed to infuriate him even more. "Are you even listening to me right now, old man?" he barked very aggressively. I listened carefully to the background noise on the call. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and soft jazz music. They were still happily celebrating their successful theft while I was literally freezing outside in my cold truck. I cleared my throat, the dry air scratching against my vocal cords. "Where exactly is my money, Jordan?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second before Jordan let out an exasperated sigh. "What money?" he scoffed dismissively, trying poorly to feign ignorance. "Do not play stupid with me tonight," I replied firmly, staring at the zero balance still glowing on my phone screen. $600,000 was just wired out of my savings account. The house Loretta and I built together was sold from right under my feet using a forged signature. "Where is my money?" Jordan dropped the angry son routine instantly. His tone shifted into something terrifyingly clinical and cold, sounding exactly like his manipulative wife. "We moved those funds into a secure offshore trust to protect your assets from scammers," he announced proudly, as if he had done me a massive favor. "You have been making very poor choices lately, Dad. You are clearly deteriorating mentally. We had to step in and take full control of your estate before you lost it all." My grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing groaned under the immense pressure. "I am completely lucid," I fired back quietly. "You both stole everything I own." Jordan chuckled, a sickening sound that finalized the utter destruction of our relationship. "Think whatever you want," he said coldly, "but the paperwork is absolutely flawless. We hold the legal power now. In fact, since you clearly cannot take care of yourself anymore, we already booked you a permanent room at a state-funded nursing home on the east side of town. They are currently sending a medical transport van to pick you up tonight. Have a great Thanksgiving, Dad." The call disconnected abruptly, leaving me completely alone in the deafening silence. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared at the glowing dashboard of my freezing truck. A lesser man might have broken down and cried. A weaker man might have surrendered to the immense gravity of the betrayal, but I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. 40 years in the construction business taught me that when a structure is actively collapsing, you do not stand there and weep over the broken concrete. You immediately brace the load-bearing walls and prepare for a massive, controlled demolition. I shifted the heavy gear column into drive and pressed my foot firmly onto the gas pedal. I navigated the dark suburban streets with absolute precision, steering my old Ford back toward the upscale neighborhood I had just left. The heater finally kicked in, warming my numb fingers as my mind organized the tactical layout of the impending confrontation. I was not going to let them celebrate their theft in peace. I pulled up to Jordan's perfectly manicured lawn, parking my beat-up old truck right behind Heather's expensive imported SUV. I turned off the engine and walked slowly toward the brightly lit front door. The storm was here. I did not bother knocking. I simply turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The cheerful sounds of clinking wine glasses and loud laughter spilled into the grand foyer, confirming my suspicion that they were thoroughly enjoying the spoils of their recent crime. I marched straight down the hallway and stepped right into the dining room. The conversation died instantly. Every single head turned in my direction, eyes wide with absolute shock at my sudden return. Jordan dropped his silver fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. Heather froze with a crystal wine glass pressed against her lips, her artificial smile completely vanishing. I did not say a word to any of the well-dressed guests sitting around the expensive table. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out the large electronic tablet I kept in my truck for viewing construction blueprints. I had taken a crystal-clear screenshot of the zero balance and the outgoing wire transfer on my banking application. I walked directly over to the center of the table where the massive roasted turkey sat on a silver serving platter. With a swift and calculated motion, I slammed the digital tablet right into the middle of the platter, splashing hot gravy across the white linen tablecloth. "Look closely at your hosts," I announced, my voice echoing like a thunderclap across the silent room. The guests leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to pure horror as they read the glowing red numbers on the screen. $600,000, I stated firmly, staring directly into Heather's terrified eyes. "That is the exact amount my own son and his lovely wife stole from my life savings just 1 hour ago. They forged my signature, sold my house from right under my feet, and drained my entire retirement fund to line their own pockets." A collective gasp erupted from the dinner guests. A woman seated near the window covered her mouth with both hands. The sophisticated facade Jordan and Heather had carefully constructed for their wealthy friends was instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They wanted everyone to believe I was losing my mind, but the digital evidence resting in the turkey gravy told the absolute, undeniable truth about who the real monsters in this room actually were. I stood tall and waited for answers. Heather did not retreat. Instead, she fully committed to the role of the tragic, misunderstood caretaker. She slammed her hands onto the table, knocking over her wine glass, and burst into immediate violent sobs. Large crocodile tears streamed down her perfectly powdered cheeks as she looked frantically around the room at her wealthy friends. "Please do not listen to his paranoid delusions," she cried out, her voice trembling with expertly crafted sorrow. "Jordan and I have been living an absolute nightmare trying to protect him. His mental health has completely deteriorated over the last few months. He wanders around aimlessly, leaves the stove on, and gives his money away to complete strangers. We did not steal his life savings. We legally moved those funds into a secure trust to protect his assets from scammers who prey on vulnerable seniors." She walked around the long mahogany table and tried to grab my arm, playing the part of a loving daughter-in-law desperate to save a confused old man. I firmly yanked my arm away from her grasping fingers, refusing to let her toxic hands touch my coat. "If you wanted to protect my assets from scammers," I replied with a completely calm and steady voice, "you would not have sold my property to a corporate shell company under the cover of darkness. You would not have forged my medical records to gain an unlawful power of attorney." Jordan finally stood up, his face flushed bright red with extreme embarrassment. "Dad, please stop making a massive scene," he pleaded weakly, looking around at the guests who were now whispering aggressively among themselves. "You are sick. We are just trying to get you the professional medical help you desperately need." Heather nodded vigorously, wiping a fake tear from her eye. "The ambulance is already on its way right now," she whispered to me. Before I could formulate a response to her disturbing threat, heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. 3 large men dressed in dark blue medical scrubs marched aggressively into the dining room. They were not paramedics from the local hospital. Their uniforms bore the embroidered logo of a private for-profit behavioral transport company. The lead orderly, a towering man with broad shoulders and cold eyes, stepped forward holding a thick nylon restraining strap. "Mr. Rollins," he said in a loud, authoritative tone that commanded immediate obedience, "your family has legally authorized us to safely transport you to an assisted living facility. We strongly recommend that you cooperate and come quietly so nobody gets hurt." They were not here to help me. They were a hired extraction team paid entirely by Heather to forcefully remove the only obstacle standing between her and my stolen fortune. The guests sat frozen in terrified silence, watching as the 3 massive orderlies slowly surrounded me like a pack of starving wolves cornering a wounded animal. Jordan cowardly looked down at his expensive shoes, refusing to make eye contact as his wife executed the final phase of her malicious plan. I glanced at the thick restraining strap dangling menacingly from the orderly's muscular hand. They fully intended to drag me out of this house in restraints, declare me legally insane, and lock me away in a dilapidated state facility where no one would ever hear my voice again. I was completely outnumbered, entirely unarmed, and financially ruined. But I was not a weak, senile old man. I was a structural engineer who knew exactly how to find the weakest point in any solid barrier. The lead orderly lunged forward to grab my left shoulder, signaling the violent start of my very imminent and entirely forced abduction. The muscular orderly lunged forward, his massive hands reaching to clamp down on my left shoulder. I did not flinch or step back. My mind instantly calculated his velocity and the slick surface of the polished hardwood floor beneath his heavy boots. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career anticipating physical collapse and understanding leverage. Right before his fingers grazed my winter coat, I abruptly sidestepped and grabbed the heavy wooden edge of the mahogany dining table. Using my legs rather than my back, I channeled all my remaining physical strength and heaved the table violently upward. The massive platter of roasted turkey, expensive crystal wine glasses, and porcelain plates launched into the air, creating a chaotic explosion of hot gravy and shattered glass. The lead orderly slipped on the greasy mess, crashing hard into the wall alongside 2 terrified dinner guests. Heather shrieked in absolute horror as her pristine Thanksgiving dinner was utterly destroyed. I did not wait to watch the rest of the expensive china shatter. While the 3 hired guards were momentarily blinded by the flying debris and scrambling to regain their footing, I turned and sprinted straight down the hallway toward the kitchen. Jordan yelled my name, but his voice was drowned out by the sheer chaos unfolding behind me. I slammed through the swinging kitchen doors, bypassed the shocked catering staff, and practically ripped the back patio door off its hinges. The freezing night air hit my face like a brick wall as I plunged headfirst into the dense pine woods behind their sprawling suburban backyard. Branches violently whipped against my heavy coat, scratching my face and tearing at my clothes, but I kept pushing forward through the absolute darkness. I knew the dense tree line eventually connected to a secondary access road where I had strategically parked my truck earlier. I could hear the angry shouts of the orderlies echoing faintly in the distance, sweeping the lawn with their flashlights, but they were far too late. I safely reached the rusty door of my old Ford, slipped quickly inside, and vanished completely. I drove aimlessly for several miles until I found a deserted supermarket parking lot bathed in the sterile glow of a single flickering street lamp. Pulling into the darkest corner, I turned off the engine and listened to the heavy silence of the night. The temperature inside the metal cabin plummeted rapidly, forcing me to curl up beneath a thin emergency blanket I kept stuffed behind the passenger seat. Sleep was entirely impossible. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, I saw Heather's triumphant smirk and Jordan's cowardly downward gaze. Instead of resting, my brain automatically shifted into professional mode. I spent my prime years as a lead construction supervisor managing massive million-dollar commercial projects across the state. My entire life had been defined by a deep dedication to creating permanent structures from nothing. I knew exactly how to pour concrete foundations, install steel support beams, and read complex architectural schematics with flawless precision. Building required extreme patience, countless permits, and absolute adherence to strict structural rules. But a demolition is entirely different. Dismantling a massive building does not require gentle hands or patience. It requires planting the explosive charges at the exact critical load-bearing joints and letting gravity do the brutal work. Heather and Jordan thought they had cleverly stolen my entire life, but they had unknowingly trapped themselves inside a fragile structure built entirely on fraud and forgery. I knew how to build a legacy, but more importantly, I knew exactly how to ruthlessly tear one down. Morning eventually broke, casting pale gray light across the frost-covered windshield of my truck. My bones ached from sleeping in a rigid seated position, and my throat was completely parched. I started the engine, desperately needing the heater to thaw my stiff joints, and slowly drove out of the empty supermarket lot toward a small local diner. The bright neon open sign flickered invitingly above the glass door. I walked inside, the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee offering a momentary comfort against the nightmare of the previous night. I sat at the laminate counter and ordered a simple black coffee and 2 eggs, needing calories to fuel the grueling legal battle ahead. When the tired waitress handed me the small paper bill, I confidently pulled out my everyday debit card and handed it over. She swiped the plastic card through the register terminal, waited a few seconds, and then frowned deeply. "It says declined," she muttered, sliding the card back across the counter. "That is impossible," I replied calmly, knowing I had a separate emergency checking account that Heather could not have possibly accessed. "Please try it one more time." The waitress swiped it again, but the machine immediately beeped in sharp rejection. A knot tightened securely in my stomach. I pulled out my phone and quickly logged into my banking application, praying for a simple network error. Instead, a massive red warning banner stretched aggressively across the very top of my mobile screen. My heart sank as I read the chilling automated message. "All associated accounts temporarily frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. Contact customer support immediately." Heather had not just stolen my retirement fund and sold my precious home. She had maliciously weaponized the bank's internal security system against me, completely and permanently locking me out of my very own personal financial life without any prior warning. I apologized quietly to the waiting waitress, reaching into my pants pocket to pull out my old leather wallet. I opened it and counted the physical currency tucked inside. 2 $20 bills. $40 was my entire net worth in the real world. That was absolutely everything I had left to my name after a lifetime of hard labor, honest living, and paying my taxes. I left a $5 bill on the counter to cover my breakfast, walked out of the diner, and returned to my freezing truck. The reality of my dire situation finally crystallized in my mind. I could not fight this complex legal battle by marching into a police station and yelling about forged documents. The local police had already proven they only care about official paperwork, and Heather currently held all the right papers. If I hired a standard estate lawyer, the legal fees would drain my non-existent funds, and they would ultimately settle for pennies, while Heather walked away incredibly wealthy. I did not need a friendly neighborhood attorney who wanted to negotiate a peaceful family resolution. I needed a relentless legal predator who understood how to systematically tear down corporate shell companies and destroy fraudulent contracts. I needed a cold-blooded shark who fought dirty in the courtroom. As I stared blankly at the frost forming on my steering wheel, a specific name suddenly echoed in my memory: Sloane Davis. She was the brilliant, ruthless daughter of a former bricklayer whose business I had saved from bankruptcy decades ago. I had heard rumors that she grew up to become the most terrifying corporate litigator in the entire city. I started my truck, gripped the wheel tightly, and headed straight toward the downtown financial district. I was going to unleash an absolute monster. I parked my battered old Ford truck in the shadow of a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the downtown financial district. The pristine lobby was lined with imported marble, a stark contrast to my scuffed work boots and weather-beaten coat. I ignored the disdainful looks from the security guards and rode the silent elevator up to the 42nd floor. The polished oak doors of Davis & Associates swung open to reveal an ultra-modern reception area. I did not have an appointment. The young receptionist immediately started to dismiss me, opening her mouth to recite a polite corporate rejection. Before she could speak, the heavy glass door of the main corner office pushed open. Sloane Davis stepped out. She wore a sharp charcoal suit, her expression as unyielding and cold as tempered steel. She froze the very moment she saw me standing there alone. Despite the passage of 15 years and the deep lines now etched across my face, she recognized me instantly. When I was a lead construction supervisor, her father was a struggling brick mason on the verge of total bankruptcy after a corrupt contractor refused to pay him for a massive commercial project. I had stepped in, threatened to halt the entire development, and ensured her father received every single dime he was owed. That money saved their family home and paid for her first year of law school. She walked past her stunned receptionist, crossed the lobby, and gripped my hand firmly. "You look exactly the same, Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice dropping all corporate pretense. I looked her directly in the eye. "I need a shark, Sloan," I told her quietly. She nodded slowly, motioning toward her office. "You just found the biggest one in the entire building." I followed her into a sprawling corner office overlooking the city skyline. She immediately locked the door behind us and pointed to a leather chair. I sat down heavily in the chair and calmly laid out the absolute cold facts of the situation without showing any kind of unnecessary emotional embellishment. I explained the forged medical documents, the sudden zero balances in my bank accounts, and the aggressive property developers currently tearing apart Loretta's pristine living room. Sloan did not offer me pity, and she did not ask me how I was feeling. Pity does not win lawsuits. Instead, she sat behind her massive mahogany desk, her fingers flying rapidly across her computer keyboard. "Let us completely bypass the standard pleasantries right now and strictly follow the paper trail," she stated coldly. "First, we need to find out exactly who bought your property and where your life savings went." She pulled up the county property register, bypassing the public interface to access the detailed commercial database. The warranty deed lists the new owner as Horizon Holdings, LLC. She muttered, her eyes scanning the glowing screen with absolute intense focus. But an LLC is simply just a hollow shell carefully designed to hide the real individuals secretly pulling the strings. She cross-referenced the state business registry running the corporate identification number through a specialized legal tracking software. Seconds later, a complex web of corporate ownership diagrams materialized on her monitor. I leaned forward as she clicked on the primary registered agent for Horizon Holdings. The name appeared in bold black text: Richard Sullivan. It was Heather's biological father. He had established this fake company 3 weeks ago solely to purchase my house under a massive veil of complete anonymity. They had conspired as an entire family to rob me completely blind, keeping every single stolen asset strictly within their own bloodline. Sloan did not simply stop her investigation right there. The property theft was only half of the equation. We still needed to locate the missing $600,000. She opened a highly encrypted forensic accounting program, the kind usually reserved for massive corporate audits. She started meticulously tracing the outgoing wire transfer from my frozen savings account. "Bank secrecy laws are incredibly strict," she explained, her eyes darting across lines of complex code. "But people who suddenly steal large amounts of cash are rarely smart enough to hide it perfectly. They always leave a digital footprint when they move the money into the real economy." She hacked through several layers of public financial disclosures, correlating the transfer dates with recently established offshore accounts. The massive stolen sum had not been moved into a secure trust fund for my health and safety, just as I had suspected. Instead, the money had been rapidly broken down into 4 smaller wire transfers and routed directly into a private corporate holding account registered under Jordan's name. Why would he route stolen cash straight into his own account instead of hiding it offshore? I asked, analyzing the structural flaw in his sloppy plan. "Criminals only move money that recklessly when they are incredibly desperate," Sloan replied smoothly. She carefully minimized the banking window and began searching the internal corporate registry for Jordan's employer, a mid-sized investment firm. She pulled up the public financial records and recent staff announcements for his company. Her fingers paused over the mouse. A sharp, predatory smile slowly formed on her face. "You do not just need a lawyer, Mr. Rollins," she said, turning the computer monitor toward me. "You need a federal prosecutor." I stared intently at the glowing screen, preparing myself for the absolute worst possible revelation. The glowing monitor displayed a highly confidential internal memo that Sloan had somehow managed to extract from the investment firm's secure server. The document was dated exactly 2 weeks ago and addressed directly to the board of directors. It was a formal notice of a massive internal investigation. According to the document, Jordan had been secretly embezzling client investment funds for the past 2 years to finance his incredibly lavish lifestyle with Heather. The luxury cars, the designer dresses, the endless vacations to Europe, all of it was paid for with stolen corporate money. But his sophisticated Ponzi scheme had finally collapsed. The internal auditors had discovered a massive deficit in his department's ledgers totaling exactly $600,000. He was given a strict 30-day deadline to replace the missing corporate funds, or the firm would officially turn him over to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution. The entire picture instantly crystallized in my mind. Jordan was not trying to put me in a nursing home to manage my health. He was desperately trying to avoid going to federal prison. He and Heather had stolen my entire retirement savings and the equity of my home strictly to cover up his massive corporate crimes. They had sacrificed my entire life to save themselves. Sloane leaned back in her expensive leather chair, clasping her hands together. They did not just commit real estate fraud against you, Mr. Rollins, she explained softly, her eyes shining with pure legal malice. By moving your money into that corporate account to cover his stolen funds, Jordan just committed federal money laundering. The trap they built for you is actually a federal crime scene. My phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Heather. We are filing for full conservatorship today. I stared at the text message glowing on my screen. Heather was boldly declaring her next move, fully confident that she held all the power. Sloane leaned across her massive mahogany desk and read the message. Her eyes narrowed. Most lawyers would immediately advise you to call the police and report the embezzlement and the forgery, she said quietly. But if we send the police to their house right now, Jordan will immediately hire a criminal defense attorney, invoke his right to remain silent, and lock down every single piece of financial evidence. The money will disappear forever into that offshore labyrinth, and the property developers will finish gutting your home. I shook my head, my jaw set with absolute determination. I do not want them to just get arrested, I replied coldly. I want them to lose absolutely everything, just like they did to me. I want to build a trap so perfectly constructed that by the time they realize they are caught, the walls have already crushed them. Sloane smiled, a terrifying expression of pure legal predation. To build an ironclad trap, we need undeniable proof of the initial forgery. We need to physically visit the exact notary office where Heather stamped that fraudulent power of attorney document. We left her sleek corporate office and took her private town car straight to a rundown strip mall on the very edge of the city. The notary office was a small, dingy storefront sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a discount liquor store. It was exactly the kind of shady establishment desperate people used to bypass strict legal protocols. I recognized the official stamp from the forged documents. We walked through the jingling glass door, stepping into a cramped room filled with overflowing filing cabinets and the smell of stale coffee. The trap was finally beginning to take its true shape. A young clerk with heavily tattooed arms and a thoroughly exhausted expression sat behind the scratched plexiglass counter. He barely looked up from his phone when we approached. Sloane did not waste a single second with friendly introductions. She placed a crisp $100 bill flat on the counter, sliding it directly under the glass partition. The clerk stared at the money, his eyes widening slightly. Sloane pulled out a printed copy of the forged power of attorney. This document was officially notarized here exactly 1 month ago, she said in a sharp, authoritative tone. I represent the actual owner of this estate. The signature was blatantly forged by a young white woman named Heather Rollins. We need to see the security camera footage from that specific afternoon. The clerk nervously pushed the money back. I cannot do that, he stammered defensively. My manager would completely fire me if I let random people look through our private security servers. Sloane did not blink. She simply withdrew a second $100 bill from her designer purse and placed it perfectly next to the first one. Then she leaned in close. If I have to return here tomorrow with a formal police warrant and a federal subpoena, your manager is going to jail for facilitating massive real estate fraud, and you will be listed as a primary accomplice. Or you can accidentally leave the monitor facing us for 5 minutes while you take a very well-deserved coffee break. The clerk swallowed hard, looking at the $200. He slowly reached out, slipped the cash into his pocket, and turned the computer monitor directly toward us before quickly walking out the back door. We immediately scrolled through the digital archives to the exact date. There she was, right on the screen. The high-definition security video clearly showed Heather standing completely alone at the notary counter. I was nowhere in sight. Sloane quickly recorded the entire clip onto her personal phone, securing the undeniable proof we needed. We left the cramped office and stepped back out into the freezing afternoon air. We have the smoking gun, Sloane told me confidently, handing me a small stack of cash she had just pulled from the nearby bank ATM. But if they are filing for a conservatorship today, they are going to track your regular cell phone to find you and forcefully serve you with the court papers. You need to drop completely off their radar right now until I can properly file our legal counterattack. Go buy a cheap prepaid burner phone and throw your current device directly into the nearest storm drain. Then go buy yourself a clean suit. We are going to war. I took the cash and nodded. I drove my old truck to a discount electronics store and purchased a completely untraceable mobile phone paying with the physical currency Sloan provided. I walked out into the parking lot and hurled my original phone straight into a deep concrete sewer grate. My past was now fully disconnected. I drove to a nearby thrift store, my mind entirely focused on the impending battle. I spent $30 on a used but perfectly acceptable navy blue suit, a white dress shirt, and a simple red tie. I was an old construction worker, but I knew that judges respected formal presentation above all else. I returned to my cold truck and changed out of my dusty work clothes in the cramped cabin. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was no longer a victim. I was a dangerous, legal weapon. I sat in the cold cabin of my truck, buttoning the stiff collar of my white dress shirt. My new prepaid phone suddenly chirped from the passenger seat. I had only given the temporary number to one person. I picked it up and saw an incoming text message from Sloan. She did not bother with any pleasantries. The message was incredibly brief and terrifyingly urgent. "They just made their move," she wrote. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart pounding steadily against my ribs. I called her number immediately. Sloan answered on the very first ring. Her voice was sharp and laced with absolute professional fury. "I just received an automated electronic notification through the county court portal," she explained quickly. "Heather and Jordan did not wait. They just officially filed a petition for an emergency medical conservatorship over you. They submitted completely fabricated medical documents claiming you are suffering from severe, advanced dementia and pose an immediate physical danger to yourself. The judge has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. They are trying to strip away your basic human rights before you even have a chance to secure any legal counsel." I gripped the plastic steering wheel tightly. "If the judge approves their emergency petition, I will be legally declared incompetent," I said quietly. "They will have full state authorization to forcibly drag me into that miserable nursing home forever." Sloan let out a dark, predatory laugh that sent chills down my spine. "That is exactly what they think is going to happen, Mr. Rollins. They believe you are just a helpless old man hiding in the woods. They have absolutely no idea that we are walking right into that courtroom tomorrow morning holding the absolute power to destroy their lives completely." The mahogany doors of the county courthouse swung open the next morning precisely at 9 o'clock. I walked into the sterile, fluorescent-lit room wearing my new navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. Sloan walked right beside me holding a single black leather briefcase. Heather and Jordan were already seated at the petitioner's table. When Heather saw me, her eyes widened in brief panic before she quickly forced tears to well up in her eyes. The judge, an older man with a stern face, took his seat and immediately called the emergency conservatorship hearing to order. Heather did not hesitate to begin her theatrical performance. She stood up, sobbing openly into a white tissue, and approached the judge's bench. "Your Honor," she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured grief, "my father-in-law has completely lost touch with reality. He is suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia." She handed the bailiff a thick stack of medical documents. These are reports from his primary care clinic detailing his erratic behavior, severe memory loss, and complete inability to manage his own daily affairs. He wandered off into the freezing woods last night in a state of sheer delusion. We are absolutely terrified he is going to accidentally kill himself if the court does not intervene immediately. The judge carefully reviewed the forged documents, his expression softening with sympathy for the weeping woman standing before him. The malicious legal trap was now completely and entirely set for me. To further cement her fabricated narrative, Heather had hired a professional witness. A man wearing an expensive, tailored gray suit stood up and confidently approached the wooden podium. He introduced himself as Dr. William Vance, a private practice psychiatrist. I had never seen this man a single day in my entire life, yet he spoke about my mental health with absolute manufactured certainty. "Your Honor." The psychiatrist began adjusting his designer glasses. "I have thoroughly reviewed Mr. Rollins' medical files provided by his loving family. Based on the described symptoms, including aggressive outbursts, severe financial mismanagement, and wandering tendencies, it is my professional medical opinion that he poses an imminent physical danger to himself and the public. He requires immediate placement in a highly secure assisted living facility." The judge nodded solemnly, making several notes on his legal pad. Throughout this entire disgusting display of perjury, I did not shout. I did not leap up and accuse them of lying. I sat completely still at the defense table, my hands resting calmly on my lap. As a construction supervisor, I learned early on that you never interrupt an active demolition until the dust settles. I maintained an absolute terrifying silence. My icy demeanor seemed to unnerve Jordan. He kept casting nervous glances in my direction, clearly expecting me to lose my temper and prove their false allegations correct. But I remained a perfect statue carved out of cold stone. Sloane sat silently beside me, not raising a single objection as the psychiatrist continued to assassinate my character. The judge looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of judicial authority and misplaced pity. "Mr. Rollins," the judge asked gently, leaning forward over his massive wooden desk, "do you have anything you want to say in your own defense before I make my final legal ruling on this matter?" He was waiting for a confused old man to ramble incoherently and validate their claims. Instead, I simply blinked slowly and turned my absolute undivided attention toward the brilliant legal shark sitting quietly to my immediate right side. She nodded. The courtroom grew deafeningly quiet. Heather let out another pathetic whimper, clutching Jordan's arm as if bracing for a tragic outcome she had entirely orchestrated herself. Jordan refused to look over at me, his immense cowardice fully cementing the permanent fracture between us. He was moments away from successfully burying his own father alive to hide his disgusting financial crimes. The judge sighed heavily, clearly convinced by the mountain of forged documents and the paid testimony. Based on the overwhelming medical evidence presented by the petitioners today, the judge announced in a booming voice that echoed off the high ceiling, "I find that Mr. Dwayne Rollins lacks the cognitive capacity to safely manage his own physical and financial affairs. The state has an absolute duty to protect vulnerable citizens from their own deteriorating minds." He reached down and firmly grasped the heavy wooden gavel resting on his desk. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but I did not break my stoic facade. Heather shot me a triumphant, venomous smirk from across the aisle. She thought she had won the war. She thought the gavel strike would permanently erase my autonomy, transfer my remaining legal rights directly into her greedy hands, and ensure the stolen $600,000 vanished forever without a trace. I watched the judge raise the wooden mallet high into the air. Time seemed to slow down entirely. This was the exact terrifying moment they had meticulously planned for months. They wanted to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me inside a miserable state-funded facility to quietly rot away. The gavel reached its highest point, poised to deliver the final devastating blow that would end my entire life as a free man. Then a sharp, incredibly commanding voice suddenly cut straight through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. "I strongly object, Your Honor." Sloane Davis stood up smoothly from the defense table, clicking her briefcase open. The judge froze, the heavy gavel hovering precariously in the air. "Who are you?" the judge demanded, clearly irritated by the sudden interruption. "I am Sloane Davis, lead counsel for Mr. Dwayne Rollins," she replied in a voice so cold it instantly dropped the temperature in the room. "And I submit to this court that the petitioners are actively committing massive perjury to facilitate criminal fraud." Heather gasped loudly, taking a sudden step backward. Sloane did not even look at her. She confidently approached the judge's bench and slapped a sealed manila envelope down onto the polished wood. Inside that envelope is a comprehensive, pristine cognitive evaluation conducted by the chief of neurology at the Military Veterans Hospital, Sloane announced loudly. It was administered exactly 2 days ago as part of his annual routine screening. His cognitive function, memory recall, and psychological stability tested at the absolute highest percentiles for his age bracket. He is perfectly sane. The judge quickly tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the official military seals and the detailed neurological data. The color slowly drained from Heather's face as the judge lowered the paperwork. "Dr. Vance," the judge said, his voice now dangerously low as he glared at the paid psychiatrist, "your professional assessment contradicts a federal medical board. Care to explain?" The psychiatrist stammered, grabbing his briefcase and rushing out of the courtroom without answering. The judge slammed his gavel down fiercely, but not against me. "This emergency conservatorship petition is immediately denied and completely dismissed," he barked angrily. Heather collapsed into her chair, realizing her legal bullet had entirely missed its target. We had officially won the very first major legal battle of this long, brutal war against them today. We stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom and walked into the brightly lit corridor. The echoing sound of our footsteps was immediately interrupted by Jordan sprinting out behind us. He grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging frantically into the fabric of my new suit. "You think you have won, you miserable old man," Jordan hissed. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation and rage. You just ruined absolutely everything for us. I am going to make sure you suffer for this. I will hire a dozen different lawyers and drag you through civil court until you do not have a single penny left to your name." I looked down at his trembling hand gripping my shoulder, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust for the cowardly thief standing before me. I smoothly brushed his hand away without breaking my stride. "You do not have the financial resources to hire a parking attendant, let alone a dozen lawyers, Jordan," I replied coldly, leaving him standing completely frozen in the middle of the courthouse hallway. Sloan and I walked out of the building and stepped into the crisp morning air. Heather and her greedy family thought they had successfully stolen my most valuable asset, but they had absolutely no idea what they were actually dealing with. Before Loretta passed away, she had secured a private contingency plan that I had sworn to keep entirely hidden until the absolute perfect moment. I parted ways with Sloan, temporarily got into my old Ford truck, and drove across town to the elite financial district. I parked outside a highly secure private wealth management bank that did not advertise its services to the general public. I walked through the bulletproof glass doors and presented my heavy brass key to the branch manager. He escorted me down into the silent, climate-controlled vault beneath the busy city streets. The massive steel door clicked open, revealing a wall of individually numbered metal boxes. I located box number 714, the exact unit Loretta had leased 20 years ago. I inserted my brass key alongside the manager's master key. The locking mechanism turned heavily, releasing the heavy metal drawer. I was about to unleash an absolute nightmare upon the arrogant people who had aggressively tried to bury me alive today, permanently destroying their entirely fraudulent lives forever and ever right now. The manager nodded respectfully and left me entirely alone in the secure viewing room. I carried the heavy steel drawer over to the polished wooden table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, resting perfectly undisturbed on a bed of dark velvet, was a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. I broke the brittle wax seal and slid the contents onto the table. There were no stacks of cash or expensive jewels hidden inside this box. Instead, there were highly detailed, intricately drawn original topographical maps and several extremely old legal certificates. These documents were the true underlying foundation of our property. When Loretta and I originally purchased our humble 3-bedroom home 40 years ago, we did not merely buy the residential surface land. Loretta had been incredibly meticulous about legal boundaries and property rights. She had insisted that we purchase the comprehensive subterranean mineral rights directly from the county government, effectively severing them completely from the standard surface deed. I carefully unfolded the brittle paper certificates, reading the bold type that unequivocally confirmed my absolute undivided legal ownership of the earth buried deeply beneath the physical structure of my beloved family house for all of recorded legal eternity. I spread the large topographical map across the entire wooden table, tracing the faded blue ink lines with my index finger. The true value of this property was never the brick house sitting on top of the soil. It was what flowed silently underneath it. 30 years ago, city surveyors discovered a massive pressurized underground aquifer perfectly positioned directly beneath our residential plot. Because Loretta had legally severed and retained the subterranean mineral rights long before the survey was ever conducted, our specific parcel of land technically controlled the absolute exclusive access point to that immense water source. For decades, the city had no real reason to access it, so the records quietly gathered dust in the municipal archives. But times had changed drastically. A massive billion-dollar corporate entity called Apex Development was currently building a sprawling, ultra-modern commercial district on the adjacent West Side properties. To successfully supply water to their massive incoming network of luxury hotels, corporate skyscrapers, and high-end retail centers, they desperately needed to tap directly into that specific underground aquifer. Without obtaining the exclusive water access rights located exactly beneath my living room floor, the entire West Side development project would literally dry up and completely collapse under its own massive financial weight. I smiled coldly in the silent vault, staring at the incredibly powerful documents resting in my hands. Heather and Jordan had spent months plotting to steal my life savings, thinking they were executing a flawless financial crime. They had illegally sold the surface of my property to Heather's father to quickly flip it for a modest, superficial profit. But in their sheer arrogance and immense greed, they had completely failed to conduct a proper, comprehensive title search regarding the deeper subterranean layers. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting right on top of a massive, highly explosive volcano ready to erupt. I carefully gathered the incredibly valuable original certificates and the massive topographical map, sliding them securely back into the thick manila envelope. I placed the envelope into my leather briefcase and securely locked the metal drawer back into its designated slot within the bank vault. As the bank manager escorted me back up to the main lobby, the absolute brilliance of Loretta's foresight crystallized entirely in my mind. The fraudulent warranty deed that Heather had notoriously forged to illegally transfer my property to her corrupt father was entirely superficial. The forged document explicitly only transferred the rights to the physical residential surface structure. It did not contain the highly specific legal clauses required to transfer the deeply severed subterranean mineral and water access rights. Horizon Holdings, LLC, now legally owned the wooden framing, the brick walls, and the roof, but they owned absolutely nothing beneath the topsoil. Because Apex Development fiercely required total unhindered underground access to construct their sprawling new district, any surface structure standing directly above that aquifer was essentially a massive legal liability. Heather's father believed he had stolen a valuable house to flip for a quick profit, but he had actually unknowingly purchased a completely worthless structure that was actively blocking a billion-dollar corporate mega-project. The surface property was legally worthless without the subterranean rights, safely locked inside my briefcase. I walked out of the bank and stood on the busy sidewalk feeling the morning sun finally warm my face. I pulled out my prepaid burner phone and dialed Sloane's direct number. She answered immediately, her voice sharp and fully prepared for the next step. "I have the subterranean deeds," I told her calmly. "Call Apex Development right now and set up a meeting. It is time to drop the absolute heaviest hammer today." Sloane did not waste a single minute after my phone call. She leveraged her extensive network of high-powered corporate contacts to secure an immediate private meeting with the executive board of Apex Development. This was not a company that entertained walk-in appointments from regular citizens. Apex was a ruthless billion-dollar real estate conglomerate actively reshaping the entire skyline of our city with their sprawling West Side commercial project. We walked into their colossal glass headquarters just before noon, bypassing the crowded public lobby to enter an exclusive private elevator. The stainless steel doors opened on the 50th floor, revealing a massive boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast construction zones below. 3 senior executives and their lead corporate counsel were already sitting at the long mahogany table, looking incredibly impatient. They clearly thought I was just a desperate, displaced local resident looking for a tiny financial payout to quietly go away. I took a seat directly across from the chief executive officer, placing my heavy leather briefcase squarely on the polished table. I did not offer a warm greeting or engage in meaningless small talk about the local weather or their impressive architectural models. I opened the briefcase carefully, extracted the original subterranean deeds along with the topographical map, and slid them smoothly across the table. The executives leaned forward, their initial annoyance quickly transforming into absolute undivided attention as they recognized the official county seals. "You gentlemen have a massive billion-dollar infrastructure problem," I stated calmly, locking eyes with the CEO. "And I am sitting here right now holding the one and only legal solution that can actually save your entire West Side project from a permanent and catastrophic failure. Let us carefully discuss the very profitable future of your massive underground water supply today." The chief executive officer meticulously reviewed the brittle certificates, his sharp eyes darting across the faded property lines drawn perfectly over the massive underground aquifer. He passed the documents to his lead corporate counsel, who scrutinized the notarized seals with absolute legal precision. The lawyer simply nodded once, instantly confirming the undeniable validity of my absolute ownership. The executive leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, interlacing his fingers. "You possess the exclusive access rights we critically need to proceed with our development," the CEO admitted, freely dropping the intimidating corporate facade. "What is your exact price to surrender these rights to Apex immediately?" I did not flinch or show any outward signs of desperation. "I am fully prepared to permanently sign over the complete subterranean mineral and water access rights to Apex Development," I replied with an icy, unwavering tone. "The absolute, non-negotiable purchase price for this transaction is exactly $2 million paid directly into a newly established, highly secure offshore trust fund managed exclusively by my attorney." The 3 executives exchanged brief, calculated glances across the expansive mahogany table. $2 million was practically pocket change for a massive billion-dollar corporate entity trying to secure a vital urban utility line. We can absolutely authorize a $2 million wire transfer by the end of business today. The CEO agreed, rapidly reaching for a sleek silver pen resting on his leather notepad. It is a completely fair and logical price for such a critical asset. But before you draft any standard purchase agreements, I raised my hand slightly to pause his enthusiastic momentum. That $2 million payment is merely the financial aspect of my offer. There is one highly specific, non-negotiable special clause that must be permanently integrated into our binding legal contract today. Sloane stepped forward, removing a meticulously typed legal addendum from her briefcase and sliding it toward the lead corporate counsel. The clause is quite simple but absolutely mandatory, she explained, her voice echoing with pure authority in the massive boardroom. Apex Development will legally assume the total financial and legal responsibility of aggressively clearing any and all fraudulent surface claims currently hindering your immediate access to the land. You see, the physical structure sitting directly above your critical water supply was recently sold through a highly elaborate, criminally orchestrated forgery perpetrated by a completely unauthorized third party known as Horizon Holdings. The lead counsel adjusted his glasses, reading the addendum very carefully. You want us to act as your personal attack dogs to evict these squatters from the surface property, he summarized astutely, looking up from the crisp paper. I shook my head, correcting his fundamental misunderstanding of the true situation. I do not care about the physical house anymore, I replied with absolute unflinching coldness to the group. It is just wood and brick to me now. My wife is gone and the memories are firmly in my mind, not the walls. But you cannot drill massive access pipes through the earth while an illegal corporate entity sits on top claiming ownership of the surface. You must legally destroy Horizon Holdings to physically break ground. By signing this specific addendum, Apex Development formally agrees to unleash your entire army of ruthless corporate litigators to completely crush this fraudulent shell company, seize the surface land back, and eradicate the criminals blocking your project. The CEO looked at his attorney. Can we legally destroy this Horizon entity? He asked his lawyer bluntly. The corporate counsel smiled a terrifying, predatory smile. With these original subterranean deeds establishing our absolute right-of-way, we can completely and utterly bury them by early tomorrow morning. The boardroom fell entirely silent as the massive implications of the contract fully settled over the long mahogany table. The CEO reached across his polished desk, pulling the thick stack of legal documents directly toward him. He quickly retrieved his expensive silver pen, signing his name boldly across the bottom line of the finalized agreement. The lead corporate counsel quickly stamped the pages with their official corporate seal, permanently binding Apex Development to the incredibly violent legal destruction of my traitorous family. They slid the heavy contract back across the table to me. I picked up a simple black pen, holding it steadily in my right hand. I thought about the sheer terror I felt when the moving truck crushed Loretta's beautiful rose bushes. I thought about Heather's malicious fake tears in the courtroom and Jordan's cowardly betrayal of his own father. I did not feel any lingering hesitation or remorse. I signed my name perfectly on the dotted line, officially transferring the deeply buried subterranean rights to the conglomerate. With that single stroke of ink, the brutal trap was definitively sprung. I secured my $2 million trust fund, simultaneously weaponizing a billion-dollar company against the greedy people who had so arrogantly tried to bury me alive. We stood up, shaking hands with the corporate executives. As Sloane and I proudly walked out of the towering glass skyscraper into the bright afternoon sun, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. Heather and her corrupt father falsely believed they had successfully stolen a house from a helpless 69-year-old man. They were completely and entirely wrong. Starting very early tomorrow morning, their new sworn enemy was officially the most ruthless army of corporate lawyers in the entire state, and they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. While I was finalizing the monumental deal that would effectively end their entire fraudulent existence, Heather and her family were deeply immersed in a lavish celebration inside the very same house they had stolen from me. They had wasted absolutely no time tearing into the history Loretta and I had carefully built. The living room, once a quiet sanctuary filled with love and warmth, now resembled a chaotic disaster zone. Heather's father, Richard, had hired a cheap demolition crew to rapidly gut the interior so they could hastily flip the property for a quick, superficial profit. The loud, violent sound of heavy sledgehammers smashing through the drywall echoed continuously throughout the neighborhood. Pieces of the floral wallpaper that Loretta had spent an entire weekend meticulously hanging 30 years ago were now lying in filthy shreds across the hardwood floors. Heather stood right in the center of the dust-filled room, wearing a designer outfit and completely ignoring the debris falling around her shoes. She held an expensive crystal flute filled with imported champagne, laughing loudly as her father directed the destructive crew. Jordan stood nervously near the kitchen island holding his own drink, desperately trying to mask his underlying anxiety about his ongoing federal embezzlement investigation by participating in this sickening victory lap. They had invited several of their wealthy, superficial friends to witness the beginning of their new real estate venture. Caterers nervously navigated around the piles of broken wood and shattered plaster, offering silver trays of delicate appetizers to the completely arrogant guests. The entire scene was a grotesque display of unearned wealth and monumental disrespect. They were aggressively destroying a lifetime of my hard labor to build a temporary illusion of success, completely unaware that their entire world was about to violently collapse directly on their heads. Richard tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass, demanding the immediate attention of everyone in the completely ruined living room. The heavy smashing of sledgehammers temporarily ceased as the hired workers stepped back, wiping sweat from their dirty foreheads. "Thank you all for coming out today to celebrate the official launch of Horizon Holdings," Richard announced in a booming, incredibly arrogant voice. He raised his expensive champagne toward the ceiling with a wide, greedy smile. Many people incorrectly assume that real estate requires years of hard work, massive capital, and endless patience. But as my brilliant daughter Heather perfectly demonstrated this week, sometimes all it takes is a stroke of a pen and a tiny bit of extremely creative paperwork. The superficial crowd chuckled softly, raising their own delicate glasses in completely misplaced admiration. "We acquired this prime piece of residential real estate for absolutely nothing," Richard continued, his voice dripping with pure malicious pride. The previous owner was a stubborn, senile old fool who had absolutely no idea how to maximize his own financial potential. He practically handed us the keys on a silver platter. Now we are going to tear down this outdated garbage, build a modern luxury home, and double our initial investment in less than 6 months. This is what I call incredibly easy money. Heather stepped up next to her father, beaming with absolute unearned pride as she linked her arm through his. To easy money, she loudly echoed, tipping her glass back and drinking the expensive champagne. They stood there, bathing in their own fabricated glory, proudly mocking my intelligence and celebrating the ruthless theft of my entire life. They fully believed they had orchestrated the absolute perfect financial crime, completely blind to the catastrophic legal storm rapidly approaching their completely unprepared doorstep. As the arrogant crowd cheered and took another sip of their imported drinks, the heavy wooden floorboards suddenly began to vibrate violently beneath their polished shoes. At first, Richard incorrectly assumed that his hired demolition crew had simply resumed swinging their sledgehammers against the load-bearing walls in the adjacent hallway. But the aggressive hired workers were still standing perfectly still in the living room, looking incredibly confused as the strange rumbling sound rapidly intensified. The expensive crystal glasses resting on the temporary catering tables started to rattle loudly, clinking against each other as the physical trembling of the entire house grew significantly stronger. The low, guttural roar of massive diesel engines completely drowned out the soft background music playing from Heather's portable wireless speaker. Jordan dropped his champagne glass, the fragile crystal shattering against the floor as he stumbled backward in sudden panic. "What the hell is going on out there?" Richard shouted furiously, marching aggressively toward the large bay window overlooking the destroyed front yard. Heather quickly followed her father, wiping spilled wine from her designer dress, her face twisting into an ugly expression of pure outrage. They peered through the dusty glass pane, expecting to see a careless local delivery truck accidentally backing over their newly installed mailbox. Instead, their greedy eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror. An entire fleet of massive yellow industrial earth movers, gigantic hydraulic excavators, and enormous commercial bulldozers had completely surrounded the entire perimeter of the residential property. The heavy machinery bore the very distinct, highly recognizable corporate logo of Apex Development painted boldly across their thick steel panels. The massive, terrifying vehicles idled aggressively on the front lawn, their gigantic metal treads utterly crushing whatever remained of Loretta's beautiful rose bushes. The fragile brick house was now entirely and completely besieged by an unstoppable billion-dollar mechanical army on all outward sides. Richard violently threw open the damaged front door and stormed out onto the ruined porch, his face flushed with pure, uncontrollable rage. He still firmly believed that he was the absolute king of this residential domain. "Get these disgusting machines off my private property right now," he screamed at the top of his lungs, waving his empty crystal champagne flute in the air like a madman. "I am calling the police to have every single one of you arrested for criminal trespassing." Before his loud threat could even echo across the dusty lawn, a long convoy of sleek black corporate SUVs smoothly pulled into the driveway, blocking any possible escape route. The dark-tinted windows rolled down and the doors simultaneously opened in perfect, terrifying synchronization. A dozen high-powered corporate executives and ruthless attorneys dressed in immaculate tailored suits stepped out onto the crushed grass. They did not look intimidated by Richard's furious screaming. They looked at him the exact same way a boot looks at an insignificant insect. Stepping out of the lead vehicle, directly behind the sharply dressed lawyers, was the fully uniformed county sheriff, accompanied by 4 heavily armed deputies. The serious sheriff did not look remotely sympathetic to Heather's completely shocked family. The lead corporate counsel for Apex Development calmly walked up the porch steps, completely ignoring Richard's frantic yelling. The attorney reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of freshly stamped legal documents. He shoved the official court injunction directly into Richard's trembling chest. "You are not the legal owner of this site," the lawyer stated coldly. "Your fake company is currently conducting illegal demolition on subterranean property owned exclusively by Apex Development, and the sheriff is here to permanently shut your entire fraudulent operation down right now today." Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple as he snatched the thick stack of legal documents from the attorney's outstretched hand. He furiously waved his own falsely obtained warranty deed in the air, practically spitting, as he yelled directly into the face of the calm county sheriff. "This is my absolute private property," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure outrage. "I have the officially stamped county deed proving that Horizon Holdings legally purchased this entire residential plot, and I demand that you arrest these trespassing corporate thugs immediately before I sue this entire city for massive civil rights violations." The heavily armed deputies did not even flinch at his loud, empty threats, keeping their hands resting completely casually on their duty belts. The lead corporate counsel for Apex Development stepped forward, adjusting his expensive silk tie with absolute terrifying calm. He did not raise his voice or show any signs of intimidation toward the screaming man. Instead, he simply looked at Richard with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a frozen lake. "Your forged warranty deed explicitly covers only the superficial residential surface structure, which is completely worthless to us," the Apex lawyer stated with lethal precision. "My client currently holds the absolute exclusive and legally severed subterranean mineral rights extending directly beneath your feet, and we have a signed judicial order granting us immediate unrestricted physical access to our underground property by any necessary means." Richard froze completely, the heavy paper deed suddenly trembling in his suddenly weak hands. He desperately looked down at his own fraudulent document, his arrogant mind desperately struggling to comprehend the massive, fatal loophole he had entirely overlooked during his incredibly sloppy legal theft. The deafening roar of the idling bulldozers behind him suddenly sounded like an absolute death knell for his completely ruined financial future beginning right now this very day. The stern county sheriff stepped forward, effectively blocking Richard from taking another aggressive step toward the corporate attorneys. He did not look at the fraudulent deed fluttering in the freezing wind. He looked directly at the terrified man holding it. "That is unfortunately not your only massive legal problem today, Mr. Sullivan," the sheriff announced, his deep voice cutting through the mechanical noise of the surrounding heavy machinery. "Our department received highly credible documented evidence earlier this morning, proving that the initial power of attorney used to execute this entire residential sale was entirely forged. We have high-definition security footage from the notary office clearly showing your daughter illegally stamping those documents without the rightful owner present." Richard gasped, his face draining of all its previous angry color, turning into a sickly shade of pale gray. He turned his head slowly, looking at Heather, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the ruined wooden porch. "You assured me this transaction was completely clean and untraceable," Richard hissed at his own daughter, the illusion of their perfect criminal family instantly shattering into pieces. The sheriff rested his heavy hand directly on his duty belt, staring coldly at the terrified older man. As the registered owner of Horizon Holdings, you are currently the primary suspect in an active criminal investigation for massive real estate fraud, the sheriff stated firmly. Because the stolen property value far exceeds the state limits, you are officially facing felony fraud charges of the absolute highest degree. I suggest you tell your demolition crew to pack up their sledgehammers and vacate this active crime scene immediately before I place you in handcuffs right now. Richard stumbled backward, the crushing weight of inevitable prison time finally breaking his arrogant spirit completely into tiny little fragmented pieces forever today. Heather watched her invincible father crumble beneath the immense pressure of the law, her mind racing frantically as she fully realized the horrifying extent of their complete legal destruction. The arrogant guests who had been happily drinking her expensive champagne just moments ago were now practically sprinting toward their luxury vehicles, absolutely desperate to escape any direct association with a massive federal crime scene. Jordan stood completely paralyzed near the shattered front window, his face buried deeply in his trembling hands, offering absolutely zero protection or guidance. Heather knew with absolute certainty that her father was going down, and she knew she was the one who had physically committed the forgery caught perfectly on high-definition security cameras. Absolute raw panic finally consumed her entirely. She did not stay to comfort her devastated father or consult with her coward of a husband. She turned around abruptly, sprinting wildly across the ruined hardwood floor, her expensive designer heels snapping loudly against the scattered demolition debris. She rushed out the back patio door and ran straight toward her imported luxury SUV parked haphazardly on the rear lawn. She forcefully yanked the heavy driver's side door open and practically threw herself into the premium leather seat. Her hands shook violently as she reached into her designer leather tote bag, desperately pulling out her sleek silver laptop. She flipped the screen open, waiting agonizingly for the complex facial recognition software to quickly unlock the secure device. Her only remaining lifeline was the $600,000 they had maliciously stolen from my retirement savings account and hidden within Jordan's corporate holding structure. If she could just quickly access those stolen funds before the police froze their personal accounts, she foolishly believed she could completely buy her way out of this awful nightmare situation immediately. The bright screen illuminated her terrified face as the secure portal finally opened to reveal the massive stolen balance sitting quietly inside Jordan's private account. Heather did not pause to consider the immense legal danger of rapidly moving such an astronomical sum of money while law enforcement officers were actively swarming the front yard. Her greedy mind was entirely focused on immediate, desperate self-preservation at any cost. She hastily typed her husband's highly confidential security credentials into the banking interface, completely bypassing the standard verification protocols they had carefully established. She aggressively clicked on the international wire transfer option, deciding right then to abandon her family completely and flee the country before the heavy handcuffs could lock securely around her wrists. She frantically entered the complex routing numbers for a highly secretive, totally anonymous offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. She typed the exact amount of $600,000 into the required transfer field, her manicured fingers slipping awkwardly against the smooth keyboard in her sheer panic. Taking one final, incredibly shallow breath, Heather boldly slammed her finger down onto the green confirm button, watching eagerly as the digital loading circle began to spin rapidly on the screen. She closed her eyes, praying for the immediate confirmation message that would permanently secure her stolen wealth. But Heather was completely and utterly unaware of the sophisticated digital trap Sloan Davis had already meticulously woven into that specific account. By blindly initiating a massive international wire transfer using funds directly linked to an ongoing corporate embezzlement investigation, she did not secure her ultimate financial freedom. She unknowingly tripped a highly sensitive digital alarm, instantly triggering a massive, irreversible federal alert directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI right now, today, in real time, without any fail. Heather's trembling finger lifted from the green confirm button, leaving her entirely oblivious to the massive digital avalanche she had just unleashed. She foolishly believed that the internet was a vast, untraceable ocean where stolen money could simply vanish into the dark. But the modern financial system is a highly guarded fortress, and Sloan Davis had already handed the federal government the exact master keys to Jordan's accounts. The moment Heather initiated that $600,000 offshore wire transfer, the digital request did not simply fly across the globe to the Cayman Islands. It immediately hit a highly secure firewall at the primary banking institution. Days ago, Sloan had quietly presented the bank's internal fraud department with undeniable legal evidence of Jordan's massive corporate embezzlement, successfully petitioning them to place a highly classified federal hold on his entire financial portfolio. Instead of processing the illegal transfer, the bank's automated security matrix instantly flagged the massive transaction as an active, real-time money laundering event. A silent digital alarm was immediately transmitted directly to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, providing them with the exact IP address, the precise geographical location of Heather's laptop, and the complete routing history of the stolen funds. Heather sat in the luxurious driver's seat of her imported SUV, staring eagerly at the loading screen, desperately waiting for a confirmation message that was never going to arrive. Her panicked, greedy action had just provided the federal government with the ultimate smoking gun. This entire catastrophic chain reaction was not a random stroke of legal luck. It was the absolute culmination of a devastating truth that had been quietly set in motion during that fateful Thanksgiving dinner. When I received that frantic anonymous phone call warning me to leave Jordan's house immediately, I did not know the identity of the terrified woman on the other end of the line. It was not until Sloan hacked into the secure internal servers of Jordan's investment firm that the final puzzle piece perfectly snapped into place. The hushed voice belonged to a young woman named Clara, who worked closely as Jordan's personal executive secretary at the corporate financial firm. For several agonizing months, Clara had been noticing highly suspicious, completely unauthorized adjustments being made to several major client investment portfolios. She watched quietly as massive sums of corporate money were meticulously funneled directly into dummy accounts before vanishing entirely. When the internal company auditors quietly announced their surprise investigation, Jordan panicked immensely. He began aggressively pressuring Clara to falsify the daily transaction logs and destroy his printed emails to hide his massive theft, recognizing that she was being maliciously set up to take the ultimate fall for his federal crimes. Clara was absolutely paralyzed by pure fear. On Thanksgiving evening, she accidentally discovered Jordan's incredibly dark plan to forcibly commit me to a miserable state-funded nursing home so he could quickly liquidate my entire life savings to replace his stolen corporate funds. Driven by sheer moral outrage and a desperate need to protect an innocent old man from total destruction, she used a completely untraceable prepaid mobile device to call me directly during the dinner party. Her brave warning gave me the exact critical head start I needed to successfully survive the freezing night and eventually hire the brilliant Sloan Davis. Now, Clara was actively cooperating with the federal authorities as a protected corporate whistleblower, happily providing the exact daily ledgers the federal government absolutely and desperately required to completely and entirely bury my treacherous son inside a dark federal prison forever today, without fail. Fast forward to exactly 4 o'clock in the morning. The quiet, upscale suburban neighborhood where Jordan and Heather lived was entirely draped in absolute peaceful silence. The wealthy residents were sleeping soundly in their massive beds, completely unaware of the massive tactical operation actively unfolding right outside their pristine windows. A convoy of unmarked matte black federal transport vans smoothly rolled down the empty street, turning their headlights off to maintain absolute stealth. They parked silently at the edge of Jordan's perfectly manicured lawn. The heavy sliding doors opened simultaneously, and 24 heavily armored federal tactical agents poured out into the freezing night air. They were dressed in full combat gear, carrying heavy ballistic shields and high-powered tactical rifles, moving with the terrifying synchronized precision of a highly trained military strike team. There were no polite knocks or friendly warnings tonight. The lead breaching agent stepped up to the massive custom-built mahogany front door that Jordan had purchased with stolen corporate money. He firmly planted a heavy steel battering ram directly against the expensive lock mechanism. With one single, incredibly violent thrust, the heavy wooden door was entirely blown off its reinforced hinges, crashing loudly onto the marble foyer floor. The explosive sound echoed like a massive bomb detonating in the quiet neighborhood. Federal agents swarmed aggressively into the grand hallway, their bright tactical flashlights piercing the complete darkness as they rapidly cleared every single room on the ground floor. Police dogs barked furiously in the distance as the sheer chaos abruptly woke the surrounding neighbors. This was not a standard polite white-collar arrest where a lawyer quietly negotiates a peaceful daytime surrender. This was a maximum force tactical breach designed specifically to completely overwhelm and immediately neutralize a highly desperate federal criminal before he could successfully destroy any remaining digital evidence hidden inside the house. Jordan was abruptly ripped from his deep sleep by the deafening sounds of heavy combat boots aggressively stomping up his expensive carpeted staircase. Before he could even sit up in his luxurious king-sized bed, the heavy bedroom door was violently kicked open, slamming hard against the interior wall. 4 massive federal tactical agents stormed directly into the master suite, blinding him entirely with the intense white beams mounted tightly on their tactical rifles. "Get out of the bed and put your hands flat on the floor right now," the lead agent roared his voice, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or hesitation. Jordan trembled uncontrollably in sheer terror, completely paralyzed by the massive, overwhelming force. An agent quickly reached down, grabbed him roughly by the shoulder of his expensive silk pajamas, and yanked him forcefully out of the warm bed. Jordan crashed heavily onto the hard wooden floor, gasping loudly for air as a heavy tactical boot firmly pressed down squarely between his shoulder blades. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly, locking tightly around his wrists in a permanent and unforgiving grip. He was unceremoniously dragged out of his beautiful master bedroom, completely humiliated, as the agents frog-marched him forcefully down the brightly lit staircase. Heather was nowhere to be seen, having successfully fled the previous afternoon, leaving her cowardly husband to entirely face the absolute worst consequences, entirely, completely alone. They dragged Jordan out onto the freezing front lawn, shoving him aggressively against the cold metal hood of a massive black federal vehicle. Jordan Rollins, the lead federal agent, announced coldly, pulling a thick arrest warrant directly from his tactical vest. "You are officially under federal arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and aggravated money laundering. Your entire fraudulent life is completely over today forever." The harsh fluorescent lights of the federal interrogation room buzzed loudly overhead, casting long, cold shadows across the scratched, stainless steel table. Jordan sat shivering in the uncomfortable metal chair, still wearing his expensive silk pajamas, his wrists aching from the heavy steel handcuffs that tethered him to the heavy desk. The sheer reality of his catastrophic downfall had finally shattered his arrogant illusion of absolute invincibility. The heavy steel door clicked open and 2 stern federal agents escorted Heather into the freezing room. She had been intercepted at the international airport terminal just an hour ago, desperately trying to board a one-way flight to the Cayman Islands. They forced her into the metal chair directly across from her terrified husband. Jordan leaned forward eagerly, his panicked eyes darting toward the 2 silent agents standing perfectly still by the closed door. He frantically lowered his voice to a desperate, pathetic whisper. "Heather, you have to listen to me right now," Jordan pleaded, his voice cracking with immense fear. "They are preparing to charge me with federal embezzlement and massive wire fraud. The bail amount is going to be absolutely astronomical. You need to immediately log into the secure offshore holding accounts and use the $600,000 we transferred from my father. Pay whatever it completely takes to get us both out of this nightmare today. We can hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the state and completely bury this entire investigation in endless legal paperwork." He stared at her with desperate wide eyes, fully expecting his brilliant partner in crime to execute their final escape plan. He firmly believed that their stolen wealth was still a completely viable weapon they could effectively use to buy their ultimate legal freedom right now, this exact single second today. Heather did not cry or reach across the cold metal table to comfort her terrified husband. Instead, she stared directly at Jordan with an expression of absolute chilling indifference. She slowly crossed her arms over her expensive designer jacket, completely unfazed by his pathetic, desperate begging. "There is absolutely no offshore money left to save you, Jordan," she replied, her voice echoing with pure, calculated malice in the small room. "The federal government officially froze every single financial asset we possess the exact second I blindly initiated that wire transfer at the property site. The money is entirely gone, and my father is currently facing 20 years in a maximum security facility for massive real estate fraud." Jordan gasped, the remaining blood completely draining from his pale face. "But we are legally married," he stammered weakly, completely oblivious to her true nature. "We can still actively fight these federal charges together as a unified front." Heather let out a short, incredibly harsh laugh that completely shattered his fragile hope into a million irreparable pieces forever. "I am not going to rot inside a miserable prison cell for the next decade just because you were too incredibly stupid to hide your own corporate embezzlement properly," she stated with lethal precision. "I sat down with the lead federal prosecutor exactly 30 minutes ago, Jordan. I fully signed a comprehensive ironclad legal immunity agreement to absolutely protect myself from any and all pending criminal charges presented today. I gave them complete unrestricted access to all your hidden corporate ledgers, your private communication logs, and your personal digital passwords. I explicitly testified that you aggressively orchestrated the entire financial scheme completely alone without my knowledgeable consent whatsoever. I completely traded your pathetic life to keep myself and my own father permanently out of federal prison, starting right now, this very exact single second forever. Heather did not wait for his devastated response. She simply stood up from the cold metal chair, smoothed the invisible wrinkles from her designer jacket, and walked straight out of the federal interrogation room without ever looking back at him. The heavy steel door slammed shut, echoing with a loud, absolute finality that completely sealed his horrific fate. Jordan was left sitting entirely alone in the freezing room, completely paralyzed by the massive weight of his total destruction. In less than 24 hours, his entire arrogant world had violently collapsed. He had permanently lost his beautiful luxury home, his high-paying corporate career, and his entirely superficial marriage. The wealthy friends he had aggressively tried to impress with his stolen money were currently deleting his contact information from their phones, desperate to avoid any federal association. He realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that he was going to spend the absolute best years of his life locked inside a miserable concrete federal prison cell surrounded by dangerous criminals who would show him absolutely zero mercy forever. The intense reality of his isolated future suddenly crushed his chest like a massive concrete block. He began to sob uncontrollably, his tears falling silently onto the cold stainless steel table. A stern federal detective slowly stepped back into the sterile room, holding a thick stack of printed indictment papers, completely detailing every single one of his undeniable corporate crimes. Jordan looked up, his face entirely covered in tears and pure, pathetic desperation. "Please," Jordan begged the detective, his voice cracking with immense emotional agony. "I have absolutely nobody left in this entire world to help me right now. I completely understand my rights. I just desperately need to make one single phone call before you lock me away inside that cell forever." The stern federal detective stared down at the broken man sobbing at the table, completely devoid of any genuine sympathy. He slowly reached into his dark jacket pocket, pulled out a standard-issue mobile device, and placed it firmly on the cold steel table. "You have exactly 2 minutes to make your call," the detective stated coldly, stepping back to observe the final pathetic moment. Jordan snatched the phone with trembling fingers, his vision entirely blurred by his endless stream of desperate tears. He frantically dialed the only phone number he had ever fully memorized since his childhood. I was sitting comfortably in the leather chair of Sloan Davis's luxurious office, quietly drinking a warm cup of premium black coffee, completely at peace with the incredibly violent legal storm we had successfully unleashed upon them. When my new prepaid burner phone began to vibrate on the mahogany desk, I already knew exactly who was calling me. I slowly picked up the device and pressed it to my ear, maintaining my absolute terrifying silence. Dad Jordan violently sobbed into the receiver, his voice completely unrecognizable, entirely stripped of its former arrogant pride. "Please, Dad, you have to help me right now. Heather completely betrayed me to the feds, and I am going straight to federal prison. I am so incredibly sorry for absolutely everything I did to you and Mom. Please just hire a lawyer for me. I am begging you to save my life today." I did not raise my voice or show any ounce of emotional weakness. I simply listened to his pathetic, agonizing cries for exactly 5 seconds, letting the absolute reality of his severe punishment settle firmly into my mind. "I have no son," I stated coldly, and I hung up the phone, permanently sealing his fate. Heather had successfully secured her highly coveted criminal immunity and walked freely out of that intimidating federal building, but her absolute freedom came with a devastating, inescapable price tag. She had successfully avoided wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit, but she walked out into a harsh reality where she had absolutely zero financial resources left to her name anywhere. The federal government had permanently seized her imported luxury SUV, her expensive designer jewelry, and the massive suburban home she had occupied with my disgraced son. She was forced to carry her few remaining personal belongings in a cheap plastic garbage bag, moving back into the cramped, miserable guest bedroom of her parents' rapidly collapsing household. but the sheer misery of her current living situation was absolutely nothing compared to the massive corporate nightmare actively hunting her family down today. Apex Development, the billion-dollar real estate conglomerate I had effectively weaponized, did not simply reclaim their subterranean land and quietly walk away. Their army of ruthless corporate litigators immediately launched a massive, utterly devastating civil lawsuit directly against Richard and his fraudulent shell company. Because Heather's father had illegally delayed their incredibly critical underground drilling schedule by conducting his unauthorized surface demolition, Apex formally sued his entire estate for exactly $1.5 million in construction delay penalties and aggravated financial damages. Every single bank account tied to Heather or her father was aggressively frozen by the civil courts pending the final trial outcome. Her father was facing serious felony fraud charges while simultaneously being sued into absolute generational poverty. Heather quickly realized that her brilliant immunity deal only protected her from federal prison time. It did not offer her a single ounce of protection from complete financial annihilation. She was entirely broke, universally despised by her former wealthy social circle, and drowning in a massive ocean of aggressive corporate litigation. In her incredibly desperate and increasingly frantic mind, she foolishly believed there was still one completely viable target she could successfully intimidate alone into saving her completely ruined life right now, this very single moment today. I was sitting quietly in a small local diner the following afternoon, enjoying a black coffee and reflecting on the incredible peace that finally surrounded me. The bell above the glass entrance door chimed sharply. I did not need to turn my head to know exactly who had just walked into the establishment. Heather marched straight toward my corner booth, her designer clothes looking completely wrinkled and unwashed. She slid into the vinyl seat directly across from me without asking for permission. She immediately launched into a pathetic, highly rehearsed theatrical performance, forcing massive fake tears to aggressively stream down her pale cheeks. "Please, you have to help me right now," she whimpered loudly, ignoring the confused stares of the other diner patrons. "Jordan forced me to do all of those terrible things. I am just an innocent victim in his massive criminal scheme. You have to tell Apex Development to drop their civil lawsuit against my family. We have absolutely nothing left today." I took a very slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, staring at her with complete, unrelenting apathy. When my absolute silence confirmed that her fake tears were completely useless, her entire demeanor shifted violently. The pathetic victim facade instantly vanished completely, replaced by pure venom. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits as she leaned aggressively across the small diner table. "If you do not call off those corporate lawyers today, I swear I will make your remaining years an absolute living hell," she hissed viciously. "I will personally destroy whatever miserable life you possess." I did not flinch or react to her incredibly violent, desperate threat. I simply placed my white ceramic coffee mug back onto the laminated table with a soft, controlled click. Heather was breathing heavily, her face flushed with pure, uncontrollable rage, fully expecting me to cower in fear, just like her pathetic husband always did. She firmly believed she still possessed the power to actively intimidate a 69-year-old man who had already systematically dismantled her entire fraudulent existence. "You always possessed a severe, fatal inability to properly assess the structural integrity of your immediate surroundings," I stated calmly, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. I reached into the front pocket of my heavy winter coat and slowly pulled out a small rectangular digital device. I placed the sleek black audio recorder directly into the absolute center of the small table, making sure the bright red recording light was completely visible to her furious eyes. I had turned the highly sensitive device on the exact second she rudely barged through the diner doors. Heather stared at the blinking red indicator light, the remaining color instantly draining from her aggressive face. Every single fake tear, every single pathetic lie, and your incredibly explicit threat to violently destroy my life has been perfectly captured in high-definition audio, I explained with lethal, terrifying precision. You managed to successfully negotiate an immunity deal with the federal prosecutors for your past financial crimes, but that specific legal agreement does absolutely nothing to protect you from committing brand new criminal offenses today. Uttering a direct violent threat against a senior citizen who is also a primary witness in an active federal investigation is a severe felony in this state. You just handed me the exact loaded weapon I needed to permanently erase you from my sight completely forever today." Heather scrambled frantically out of the vinyl booth, her completely terrified eyes darting toward the exit door. She tried to aggressively snatch the small digital recorder from the table, but I swiftly slid the device safely back into my coat pocket long before her trembling fingers could even graze it. "You are an absolute monster," she screamed hysterically, her voice cracking with pure panic as she stumbled backward toward the diner entrance. I simply picked up my ceramic mug and took another quiet sip of my coffee, completely ignoring her entirely pathetic retreat. She burst through the glass doors and ran out into the freezing afternoon air, finally realizing she had just permanently sealed her own legal coffin. I finished my warm drink, left a generous cash tip for the exhausted waitress, and drove my old Ford truck straight to the downtown police precinct. I handed the pristine digital audio recording directly to the supervising desk sergeant, completely detailing her highly aggressive ambush and explicit violent threats. The judicial response was absolutely immediate and entirely unforgiving. By early the very next morning, an emergency family court judge had reviewed the terrifying audio evidence and officially issued a maximum distance permanent restraining order against Heather. She was strictly legally forbidden from coming within 1,000 feet of my physical person, my current residence, or any location I frequented under the immediate threat of mandatory state prison time. She had completely lost her husband, her stolen wealth, her wealthy social status, and now her basic freedom of movement entirely. The cornered fox had desperately tried to bite the hunter one final time, but she only managed to successfully snap her own fragile neck entirely in the brutal, unforgiving trap I had meticulously laid out for her right from the very beginning today. The very next morning, the crisp air was filled with the distinct smell of diesel exhaust and churned topsoil. I stood perfectly still behind a bright orange safety perimeter line erected by the highly efficient Apex Development Engineering team. A white hard hat rested comfortably on my head, a professional courtesy extended to me by the senior site manager who knew exactly who I was and what I had successfully orchestrated to make this project possible. Directly in front of me, sitting heavily on the ruined lawn where Loretta's prized rose bushes used to bloom beautifully, every spring was a massive yellow bulldozer. The heavy diesel engine roared to life with a deafening sound, sending a thick plume of dark smoke high into the clear blue sky. The skilled operator shifted the massive machine into gear, raising the heavy steel blade high into the air with terrifying mechanical power. I watched with absolute, unflinching focus as the thick metal treads utterly crushed the remaining debris on the front lawn and crawled relentlessly toward the front porch. The heavy steel blade made sudden violent contact with the brick facade of my former living room. The sickening sound of shattering window glass and tearing structural wood echoed loudly across the otherwise quiet suburban street. The massive wooden front door, the very same door I had proudly carried my beautiful wife through 40 years ago, splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces under the immense mechanical pressure. The upper roof groaned heavily under the sudden structural failure before entirely collapsing inward, sending a massive blinding cloud of gray dust billowing violently into the air. The physical structure that had safely housed my entire adult life was being systematically and violently reduced to absolute rubble in a mere matter of minutes. As the heavy plaster walls caved in and the brick chimney toppled over into the dirt, I realized something profoundly liberating about my current emotional state. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness, grief, or regret watching my former home get utterly destroyed. A younger, much less experienced version of myself might have wept openly at the tragic sight of his entire life's work being violently erased from the face of the earth. But 40 years spent working tirelessly in the grueling construction industry had thoroughly taught me the absolute, undeniable truth about physical structures. Houses are simply temporary arrangements of harvested wood, poured concrete, and forged steel. They are incredibly fragile things that can be easily destroyed by a fierce natural storm, a sudden electrical fire, or the malicious actions of a greedy family member. The actual home I shared with Loretta was never contained within those 4 physical walls. My true, lasting memories of her bright smile, the sweet sound of her humming gospel songs on a Sunday morning, and the profound, unconditional love we actively built together were permanently sealed securely inside my own mind. Those precious things were entirely untouchable by any bulldozer or fraudulent legal document. Heather and her corrupt father falsely believed they were stealing my most valuable asset when they forged that warranty deed, They never understood that my real wealth was my unbreakable spirit and my sharp analytical mind. I watched the bulldozer completely flatten the kitchen where I used to drink my morning coffee, feeling an overwhelming sense of final closure. The physical house had unfortunately become a toxic monument to Jordan's immense cowardice and Heather's unforgivable greed. Watching it turn into meaningless dust was not a tragedy. It was a necessary purification. Standing exactly 50 yards away, strictly confined to the public concrete sidewalk just outside the orange safety netting, was Richard and his completely devastated wife. Heather had apparently vanished completely into the dark city after our hostile encounter at the diner, leaving her miserable parents to entirely face the brutal world-shattering consequences of their collective greed completely alone. Richard looked entirely unrecognizable from the incredibly arrogant, boastful man who had proudly toasted his stolen wealth with imported champagne just a few short days ago. His expensive tailored suit hung loosely on his defeated, slumping frame, and his face was entirely drained of its former arrogant, flushed color. He clutched the chain-link fence with visibly trembling hands, his wide, panicked eyes helplessly watching his supposedly brilliant million-dollar real estate flip get violently pulverized into absolutely worthless dirt. Every single brutal swing of the heavy excavator bucket represented another massive, entirely unrecoverable financial blow to his entirely ruined estate. He was not just losing the stolen physical property today. He was actively watching his entire financial future get completely buried under the crushing, inescapable weight of Apex Development's highly aggressive civil lawsuit. Because his fraudulent Horizon Holdings company had illegally occupied the land and massively delayed the critical billion-dollar commercial project, he was now legally responsible for exactly $1.5 million in immediate corporate damages. His primary bank had already aggressively frozen his personal retirement accounts, completely seized his own residential home, and permanently locked down his business assets to securely satisfy the incoming corporate judgment. He had greedily tried to steal a secure, peaceful retirement from a helpless old man, and in doing so, he had completely signed away his own family's entire generational wealth forever. He was now a broken man standing in dust. As the final remaining wall of the ruined house crashed violently into the cracked concrete foundation, a sleek black government sedan quietly pulled up to the curb directly behind where Richard was standing. A tall, incredibly serious man wearing a plain gray suit and dark sunglasses stepped smoothly out of the vehicle. He did not look like a local police officer or a highly paid corporate attorney. He carried a distinct, terrifying aura of absolute, undeniable federal authority. The man walked directly up to Richard, completely ignoring the loud mechanical chaos of the active demolition site. He reached slowly into his breast pocket and flipped open a small, black leather wallet, flashing a bright gold federal badge directly into Richard's entirely terrified face. "Mr. Richard Sullivan," the man stated in a cold, perfectly measured tone that cut straight through the surrounding mechanical noise. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." Richard physically recoiled in pure horror, quickly releasing his tight grip on the chain-link fence as if he had just been violently struck by lightning. The federal agent calmly reached into his dark leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, officially sealed government envelope. "We have been closely monitoring the sudden, highly suspicious financial activities surrounding your newly formed company, Horizon Holdings," the agent explained with absolute lethal precision. "Our preliminary forensic investigation officially reveals that you have been actively using this fraudulent corporate shell not only to illegally acquire real estate, but to systematically evade massive amounts of federal income taxes from your primary business over the last 5 consecutive years. You are hereby officially served with a comprehensive federal audit and a formal notice of criminal tax evasion." Richard instantly collapsed onto his knees on the dirty sidewalk. Exactly 6 months passed since the heavy dust finally settled over the ruined foundation of my former home. The swift and brutal machinery of federal justice had completely dismantled the fraudulent empire Heather and her corrupt family had so arrogantly tried to build. The massive civil lawsuit initiated by Apex Development entirely drained Richard of every single hidden financial asset he possessed. The subsequent federal tax evasion charges filed by the Internal Revenue Service firmly sealed his ultimate financial doom. Unable to mount any kind of viable legal defense against the mountain of undeniable evidence, Heather's parents were officially forced to declare absolute total bankruptcy. Their sprawling suburban estate was swiftly foreclosed upon and immediately auctioned off by the bank to partially satisfy their massive corporate debts. The arrogant couple who once proudly toasted their stolen wealth with expensive imported champagne now lived in a dilapidated, rusting single-wide unit located deep inside a rundown trailer park on the absolute poorest outskirts of the city. Their new reality was completely stripped of any remaining dignity or comfort. Heather, having secured her federal immunity at the absolute cost of her marriage and her wealthy social status, fared no better in the real world. Without Jordan's stolen corporate funds to finance her lavish, superficial lifestyle, she was aggressively thrown out of her luxury apartment. Her carefully curated circle of wealthy friends had completely abandoned her, treating her name like a highly contagious disease. Left with absolutely zero marketable professional skills and a highly toxic public reputation, Heather was ultimately forced to accept a grueling minimum wage job working the lonely graveyard shift as a cashier at a dingy 24-hour gas station. She spent her long, exhausting nights standing entirely alone behind bulletproof glass, scanning cheap energy drinks and stale snacks for exhausted truck drivers under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. The designer dresses and expensive high heels she once flaunted so proudly were completely replaced by a very cheap stained polyester uniform that she hated with every fiber of her being. She had ruthlessly tried to steal a peaceful retirement from a helpless old man, confidently believing she was the smartest person in any room. Instead, she had meticulously engineered her own permanent downfall, trapping herself in a miserable, exhausting cycle of minimum wage survival, while carrying the heavy, inescapable burden of her own massive, unforgivable betrayals every single day. Despite the strict parameters of the permanent restraining order forbidding any direct physical contact, Heather's immense desperation eventually completely overpowered her basic common sense. During one particularly miserable graveyard shift, she somehow managed to illegally track down my brand new, highly unlisted private mobile phone number through a shady online data broker. She did not dare to text me, knowing the written evidence could instantly send her straight to a state prison cell. Instead, she cowardly waited until exactly 3 o'clock in the morning to quietly leave a completely pathetic, rambling voice message on my secure digital inbox. Her voice was incredibly weak, entirely stripped of that former arrogant sneer that used to constantly echo across my dinner table. "Dwayne, please pick up the phone," she whimpered pitifully into the receiver, her fake tears heavily returning to aid her massive manipulation attempt. "I am so incredibly sorry for absolutely everything that happened between us. My life is completely and utterly ruined now. I cannot survive working this awful job anymore, and my parents are literally starving in a freezing trailer. Please, you have so much money now. I am begging you to just show me some tiny shred of mercy." I woke up the next morning in my pristine, climate-controlled luxury apartment, completely surrounded by the quiet peace and security that my newly acquired trust fund reliably provided. As I sipped my rich, dark roast coffee while looking out over the beautiful city skyline, I casually checked my phone and noticed the single new voicemail notification flashing brightly on the screen. The unrecognized number immediately triggered a mild sense of caution, but I pressed play anyway to determine the caller. The very second I recognized Heather's pathetic, trembling voice begging for financial salvation, a wave of absolute coldness completely washed over me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or lingering guilt as she desperately listed her numerous miseries and begged for my forgiveness. She was entirely mistaken in believing that the immense passage of time would somehow magically erase the horrific cruelty of her past actions. True forgiveness requires genuine remorse, but she was only sorry because she had entirely lost her stolen wealth. I did not even grant her the basic courtesy of listening to the entire message. Exactly 15 seconds into her pathetic, manipulative rant, I firmly pressed the red delete button on my screen. The digital recording instantly vanished into the trash bin, completely erasing her completely toxic presence from my new life forever. Every single devastating consequence she was currently facing was the direct, undeniable result of her own malicious choices. She had brutally decided to treat an old man like a completely disposable object, entirely forgetting that every wicked action eventually demands a heavy payment. I permanently blocked the anonymous number without any hesitation, ensuring she could never disrupt my peace again. Some bridges once intentionally burned to the ground can never be rebuilt. She chose her path. I chose mine. Now she must sleep in the miserable bed she made. With Heather's desperate attempt at manipulation entirely, completely discarded and permanently blocked from my existence, I turned my full attention back toward the absolute final, ultimate chapter of this grueling legal war. Today was not just another random Tuesday on the calendar. Today was the official day of Jordan's federal sentencing hearing. I walked into my spacious walk-in closet, the soft lighting illuminating rows of neatly organized, perfectly tailored clothing. I carefully bypassed the cheap discount store navy blue suit I had hastily purchased months ago when I was desperately fighting for my basic human rights in that corrupt emergency conservatorship hearing. I no longer needed to pretend to be a helpless victim or a struggling retiree for any judge. I selected a remarkably sharp, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit purchased specifically for this deeply monumental occasion. I slipped my arms into the expensive fabric buttoning the crisp white shirt with absolute, unwavering precision. I methodically tied a deep crimson silk tie around my collar, adjusting the perfectly sharp knot in the tall mirror. The reflection staring back at me was not a weak, senile old man vulnerable to greedy predators. It was the reflection of a hardened survivor who had successfully navigated an absolute nightmare and completely destroyed his enemies using nothing but pure logic and the ruthless power of the law. I slipped a gleaming silver watch onto my left wrist, checking the exact time. The federal court was scheduled to formally convene in exactly 2 hours. Jordan was finally going to stand before a federal judge to answer for the massive financial destruction he had so arrogantly caused. I grabbed my keys, ready to deliver the absolute final, devastating blow. He absolutely thought he could so easily bury me alive forever. Today I will completely bury him. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung shut behind me, sealing the expansive chamber in absolute, intimidating silence. The room was a stark monument to uncompromising justice, lined with polished mahogany panels and dominated by the elevated judge's bench. I walked down the center aisle, my custom-tailored charcoal gray suit commanding immediate respect from the sparse gallery of onlookers. I took my seat in the front row directly behind the prosecution table. Just a few feet away sat my son. Jordan looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, well-fed corporate executive who had so proudly hosted that treacherous Thanksgiving dinner. His tailored designer suits had been replaced by a highly unflattering, poorly fitted khaki prison uniform. He had lost a significant amount of weight during his lengthy pre-trial detention, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath pale, sickly skin. His shoulders were completely slumped in utter defeat, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the defense table. He did not possess the courage to turn around and look at me. The federal judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dismantling white-collar criminals, leafed through the massive stack of indictment files. She adjusted her reading glasses and surveyed the quiet courtroom. This court has thoroughly reviewed the extensive evidence of massive corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and the abhorrent financial exploitation of a senior citizen, the judge announced, her voice echoing with absolute authority. Before I deliver my final legal sentencing in this highly disturbing matter, the court will formally open the floor. I ask now, do any direct victims of these devastating financial crimes wish to approach the podium and provide an official statement on the record today? I calmly unbuttoned my suit jacket and slowly stood up from the solid wooden viewing bench. I walked forward with extremely measured, steady steps toward the polished wooden podium positioned directly in the center of the courtroom floor. Jordan finally lifted his head, his hollow eyes meeting mine for the very first time since his dramatic arrest. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression, foolishly hoping that the innate biological bond of father and son would somehow soften my final testimony today. He expected a highly emotional speech filled with tears, parental disappointment, and perhaps a desperate plea for judicial leniency. I gave him absolutely nothing of the sort. I adjusted the small microphone and looked directly up at the federal judge. Your Honor, I began, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of any emotional fragility. The man sitting at the defense table did not simply make a foolish mistake or succumb to a momentary lapse in judgment. He executed a highly calculated, meticulously planned financial operation designed to systematically strip a senior citizen of his life savings, his legal autonomy, and his physical freedom. When he ran out of corporate funds to steal, he weaponized the medical system to declare me incompetent, intending to lock me away in a state facility to cover his tracks. I am not here today to speak to you as a grieving father mourning the tragic loss of his only son. I am standing here strictly as an independent citizen who survived a malicious, highly coordinated attack on my fundamental human rights. I respectfully request that this court applies the maximum legal penalty allowable under federal law. He calculated the exact cost of my life for his own financial gain, and now he must pay that exact mathematical debt to society. I slowly stepped away from the wooden podium without another word, leaving Jordan completely and utterly shattered. The entire courtroom fell into an incredibly heavy, unbroken silence as I returned to my front row seat. Jordan completely buried his face inside his shaking hands, openly weeping, as the absolute reality of my cold logic finally destroyed his last remaining fragment of hope. The federal judge looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated judicial contempt. "Mr. Rollins," the judge began, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a freshly sharpened blade. "Your calculated actions represent the absolute worst kind of white-collar criminality. You were trusted by your corporate clients to securely manage their financial portfolios, and you were naturally trusted by your own father to respect his dignity during his retirement. You violently betrayed both of those fundamental trusts out of nothing but sheer, pathetic greed. You attempted to forcefully institutionalize a perfectly sane man simply to hide your own massive thefts. Based on the overwhelming volume of evidence, your complete lack of genuine remorse, and the highly aggravating factors of elder exploitation, this court has reached a final decision." Jordan stopped crying and held his breath, his entire fragile body trembling uncontrollably as he waited for the final strike. The judge picked up her heavy wooden gavel, holding it firmly in her right hand. "I hereby officially sentence you to exactly 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary," the judge declared loudly, her words permanently sealing his horrific fate. "Because these are severe federal financial crimes, this sentence is to be served entirely without any possibility of early parole. You are completely remanded into federal custody effectively immediately right now today." The heavy wooden gavel dropped with a deafening explosive crack that echoed loudly against the mahogany walls. 2 armed federal marshals instantly stepped forward, grabbing his arms and forcefully hauling Jordan away to begin his long sentence behind steel bars. I did not turn my head to watch my son being dragged out of the federal courtroom through the heavy side door. I had already completely severed that biological tie the moment he actively tried to destroy my life for his own greedy preservation. The intense legal battle that had consumed my every waking moment for the past several months was finally officially over. I smoothly buttoned my custom-tailored charcoal jacket, picked up my leather briefcase, and confidently walked down the center aisle. I pushed open the massive oak doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the wide marble steps. The bright, warm afternoon sunlight immediately washed over my face, completely melting away the sterile chill of the federal building. I took a very deep, incredibly satisfying breath of the fresh city air, feeling a profound sense of absolute liberation that I had never truly experienced before in my entire life. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my newly purchased smartphone. I tapped the secure icon for my private wealth management application, the facial recognition software quickly unlocking my personal financial dashboard. There were absolutely no red warning banners or frozen account notifications glaring back at me today. Instead, the bright digital screen proudly displayed the incredibly secure balance of the irrevocable trust fund I had masterfully negotiated with the billion-dollar real estate conglomerate. $2 million sat perfectly safe and completely untouchable inside the high-yield account. They had foolishly tried to steal $600,000 in a humble brick house from a supposedly weak old man. In return, I legally annihilated their entire existence and secured a massive fortune. I smiled coldly, quietly, slipping the brand-new phone back into my pocket, completely and entirely ready for my beautiful next chapter. I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of my brand-new luxury penthouse, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. From this incredible vantage point, the sprawling city skyline stretched out endlessly before me, a glittering sea of lights pulsating with vibrant life. Far below, in the very heart of the bustling downtown district, the massive steel cranes of Apex Development were actively constructing their billion-dollar commercial empire. They were currently drilling deep into the earth, accessing the exact subterranean water supply that had permanently secured my absolute financial independence. I leaned against the sturdy glass railing, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, entirely at peace with the quiet solitude surrounding me. I did not miss the old brick house, or the quiet suburban street where I had spent 4 decades of my life. The penthouse was a pristine sanctuary, elevated high above the noise and the deception of the ground level. Every single piece of custom furniture, every polished marble countertop, and every sweeping panoramic view represented a hard-fought victory over the malicious forces that had arrogantly tried to bury me in the dirt. I had successfully transformed a devastating betrayal into a towering fortress of absolute security. The silence in my new home was no longer a heavy, suffocating reminder of my wife's absence or my son's immense cruelty. It was a golden, triumphant silence that belonged entirely to me. The following morning, I took my private elevator down to the secure parking garage and drove to the towering glass skyscraper where Davis and Associates maintained their prestigious headquarters. I did not need an appointment this time, and the receptionist immediately ushered me into the sprawling corner office. Sloane was sitting behind her massive mahogany desk reviewing complex legal briefs with the same terrifying predatory focus that had completely dismantled my enemies. She looked up and offered a rare, genuine smile as I took a seat across from her. I reached inside the interior pocket of my custom-tailored suit and slowly pulled out a crisp, certified bank check. I placed it gently onto the polished wood, sliding it directly toward her. Sloane glanced at the bold numbers printed across the document, her sharp eyes widening slightly in genuine surprise. It was a check for exactly $500,000. I do not just want to hoard this wealth in a secure offshore trust account until the end of my days, I explained calmly, maintaining absolute eye contact with the brilliant attorney who had fiercely protected my rights. I want you to use this money to officially establish a comprehensive legal scholarship fund, specifically designed for brilliant underprivileged minority students who possess the raw talent but entirely lack the financial resources to attend top-tier law schools. I want the foundation to be permanently named in honor of Loretta. My beautiful wife spent her entire career as a dedicated public school teacher, fiercely advocating for marginalized children and firmly believing that education was the ultimate weapon against systemic injustice. By funding the next aggressive generation of sharp legal minds, we ensure that vulnerable people always have a ruthless champion ready to defend them against corporate greed and familial exploitation. Sloane picked up the certified check, her expression shifting from professional respect to profound personal admiration. She promised to draft the foundational paperwork, immediately cementing Loretta's powerful legacy into the permanent bedrock of the legal community forever. As I left her bustling corporate office and walked out into the vibrant city streets, my mind inevitably drifted toward the complex, often toxic concept of family. Society constantly forces us to blindly accept the deeply flawed narrative that biological connections must automatically dictate our absolute unwavering loyalty. We are heavily conditioned to endlessly forgive the most horrific abuses simply because the perpetrator happens to share our genetic code or our last name. I had completely rejected that dangerous fallacy. Blood is merely a biological fact, a random roll of the genetic dice that determines your physical traits, but it absolutely never guarantees a foundation of respect, genuine love, or basic human decency. True loyalty is a deliberate, conscious choice demonstrated entirely through consistent actions, not empty, manipulative words spoken at a holiday dinner table. Jordan and Heather foolishly believed that my paternal obligations would force me to quietly surrender my dignity and accept my own total destruction. They completely mistook my initial silence for inherent weakness, completely failing to realize that a man who knows how to build massive structures also knows exactly how to sever toxic ties with absolute surgical precision. I refused to be a sacrificial lamb on the altar of their extreme arrogance. When forcefully presented with the ultimate agonizing choice between saving a treacherous, ungrateful son or preserving my own hard-earned dignity, I confidently chose myself. I chose my own survival, my own peace, and my own uncompromising justice. Cutting away the diseased branches of my family tree did not leave me hollow or broken. It allowed me to finally breathe clean air and actively thrive without the massive parasitic weight of their endless greed dragging me down into the cold dirt. I am no longer defined by the people who betrayed me. I am defined strictly by the incredible strength it took to completely overcome them. Which brings me to the absolute final lesson of this incredibly brutal journey and the exact reason why I decided to share my complete story with all of you today. If you are currently sitting in a room where your voice is actively ignored, where your massive sacrifices are casually dismissed, and where your fundamental worth is constantly diminished by the very people who should fiercely protect you, please listen to my words very carefully. You do not owe your absolute sanity or your hard-earned resources to anybody who treats your existence as a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish desires. You possess the absolute power to completely rewrite the ending of your own narrative right now, this very single minute. Stop gracefully accepting the unacceptable. Start quietly gathering your undeniable evidence strategically, securing your personal boundaries, and preparing to drop the absolute heaviest hammer of justice upon anyone who dares to cross your established lines. The world is incredibly full of arrogant wolves disguised as loving family members patiently waiting for you to simply close your tired eyes so they can swiftly strike. You must remain permanently vigilant, entirely grounded in your own truth, and absolutely unwilling to compromise your personal integrity for the sake of a false superficial peace. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and do not forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you believe in absolute uncompromising justice. Always remember to aggressively demand the respect you rightfully deserve. Fiercely protect your own personal dignity at all possible costs, and never under any conceivable circumstances underestimate a quiet old man who knows exactly how to flawlessly read the fine print of a legally binding contract. I also learned that aging does not mean becoming helpless or invisible. Society often conditions us to believe that with gray hair comes weakness, but true strength is found in patience, careful observation, and unwavering resolve. When people mistake your silence for cognitive decline, let them. Their arrogant assumptions will become their ultimate downfall. You possess a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. Use it as your greatest weapon against those who try to exploit you. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your own stories of overcoming betrayal in the comments below.